South Kesteven District Council Planning Committee on the 11th of August 2022. I'm Councillor David Bellamy, the Chairman of the Planning Committee, and I will be chairing this meeting today, and my Vice Chairman is Councillor Penny Milnes. Housekeeping, I'm not aware of any fire alarms, but if the fire alarm does go off, please either leave by the stairs down the middle here or by the fire escape to across there to your left, my right. The meeting point is on the green at the front of the building. Please can you ensure that you have turned off your mobile phone or that it's on silent. Please be aware that the meeting is being recorded and also being live streamed by YouTube. Could you ensure that your microphones are turned off when not speaking, please? With us today, we have Assistant Director of Planning, Emma Whitaker, Principal Planning Officers, Phil Jordan, Senior Planning Officer, Adam Murray, Legal Services, Mark Howell, and Democratic Services Officer, Amy Pride to my left. Public speakers and ward councillors, please be aware that you have 3 minutes to speak. You will be advised when you have 30 seconds left. You may finish your sentence, but not another paragraph. Councillor Milnes, could you read out the public speakers for the applications, please?
The application reference. Application reference S220615. Construction of two-storey detached dwelling and triple garage with studio above on an additional 6th plot, an addition to development approved under S19-1709. This is at the Woodyard to the rear of 11 to 17 Stamford Road, Colsterworth. Speakers today will be the District Ward Councillor, Councillor David Bellamy, and the applicant John Gibbison. Is that correct? For Hereward Homes. The case officer is Adam Murray. The second agenda item, item 5, will be S212443, which is the Mallards Pass Solar Farm Stage 2 consultation. This is land either side of East Coast Main Line near Essendine and north of Uffington. The district ward councillors who will be speaking are Councillor Rosemary Trollope-Blue and Councillor Virginia Moran, County Councillor, Councillor Ashley Baxter. From the Parish Council, Councillor Jason Halsey, Grateford Parish Council. Against, Tony Orvis, representative from Mallard Pass Action Group. And I don't think the applicants are speaking today. And David Alliston.
Thank you. We will now move on to agenda item 1. Apologies for absence and register of attendance. Amy, please.
Thank you, Chairman. We received apologies from Councillor Judy Smith, Councillor Paul Wood, Councillor Penny Robbins, Councillor Nick Robbins and Councillor John Cottier. Councillor Richard Cleaver will be substituting for Councillor Paul Wood. Councillor Sarah Trotter will be substituting for Councillor Judy Smith. And he's not quite here yet, but Councillor Robert Reid will be substituting for Councillor Nick Robbins. And just for the record, Councillor Phil Dilks will be filling the vacant seat for Alliance SK for this meeting. And I'll just do a roll call if you're happy for me to. So Councillor David Bellamy.
Present.
Councillor Penny Milnes.
Present.
Councillor Harish Bisnal Singh.
Present.
Councillor Phil Dilks.
Present.
Councillor Ian Selby.
Present.
Councillor Judy Stevens.
Present.
Councillor Ian Stoke.
Present, and I would like to give an apology for Councillor Rosemary Brown, which I didn't hear.
Councillor Richard Cleaver.
Present.
And Councillor Sarah Trotter.
Present.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Amy. Item 2, does anyone have any disclosable interest of consideration? If you believe you have at any point in this meeting, please let us know. So if you have any declarations of interest, please. I'm declaring an interest in the first item. I'll be speaking as the ward councillor. Whilst it is not personal or prejudicial, I will be speaking as the ward councillor and therefore recuse myself from the planning committee for the agenda item 4. So basically I'll be speaking on it but won't be voting on it. Item 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 14th of the 7th, 2022. If everybody's happy with the accuracy of those meetings, could I have a proposer and a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Stokes. A seconder? Councillor Stevens, thank you. Now we move on to the... Oh, I beg your pardon. Would everybody vote for the minutes, please, which have been proposed and seconded? Could you put your hand, Phil, could you put your hand up again, please? Just
Yeah.
right, okay, Doug. Okay. Thank you. We now move on to the main agenda item 4, and I'll hand over to my colleague, Vice Chairman Penny Mills.
So agenda item 4, application reference S220615, construction of a 2-storey detached dwelling, Colsterworth. The presenting officer today is Adam Murray.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, members. Yes, so this first application is S220615, and it is a full planning application for the construction of a 2-storey detached dwelling with a triple garage and studio above, which would be an additional 6th plot to the development that has been approved under S191709. And the site is the woodyard to the rear of 1117 Stamford Road, Colsterworth. The application has been referred to committee due to call-in by Councillor Bellamy as the ward member. Just to clarify an item in the report, paragraph 5.72 of the report, the ward councillor's comments, just to clarify on that, the Bourne Road residents received multiple consultation notifications from the district councillor as the local planning authority, rather than as part of the applicant's consultation exercise prior to submission of the application. So just to give a bit of a brief overview in terms of the site itself. So it's an area of just over half a hectare, so 1.3 acres of broadly rectangular land, situated to the east of Stamford Road, to the south of the main centre of Colsterworth. So it's probably not coming up very clearly on the presentation today, but it's that parcel of land sort of to the south of the main area of Colsterworth. And just to zoom in as a bit more of a detailed overview, it's an undeveloped greenfield site with access from Stamford Road, which is currently being used as a material storage area in connection with the adjacent development to the west of the former timber yard. So as I say, the site's bound to the west by the former timber yard, which has planning permission for 5 dwellings. That development now has been fairly substantially completed. And then you've got Stamford Road further to the west with residential properties fronting onto that. The land to the north is paddock land, beyond which you've got Bourne Road. And again, you've got properties fronting onto that on both sides. And then to the east and south, you have got open fields, and immediately south of the application site, you've got the allotment area. Site benefits from clearly defined boundaries on all sides. So you've got, apologies, just go back to the previous screen. So you've got an existing boundary to the west, which is marked by domestic fencing, which is the current rear boundary to the properties that have already been constructed on that site. And then to the north, east and south, you've got a fairly substantial hedgerow and tree line boundary. The current application site itself has been the subject of a previous planning application for a single plot of the same nature as currently proposed. That application S21-1566 was refused under delegated powers due to the absence of local community consultation and without evidence that it would meet a local housing need. That refusal is currently the subject of an appeal, which is currently with the Planning Inspectorate. So just to provide members with some images showing the site. So this is an image taken from the internal access road currently serving the development to the west, so the former timber yard, looking toward from the end of that application site. So effectively what you see in front of you, this fence line in front of you is the western boundary of the application site, and then you've got the view then into the actual site itself. And then just the images here are some of the properties that have already been completed at that site, just to give a sort of a taste of what those properties look like. So you'll see constructed of stone there, red pan tiles. And then just to give a bit of context for the site in the surroundings. So this is an image taken from the public footpath, which runs from Bourne Road. So it runs through the sort of the paddock land that bounds onto the north. So this is taken from within that paddock land. So you can see there on the right hand side, just the roofscape of the existing properties, and the application site would then effectively be to the left of that. And then just looking then from the footpath, looking sort of from the eastern side of the site, so you can see it's a fairly well screened site there, fairly mature boundary, which provides a clear sort of delineation between the site and the surrounding area. And then just looking from a further distance from the south, looking back towards the village from a further position on that public footpath. So again, you can see there from a position from the south how the existing properties are fairly evident and visible from that public footpath. And you can see just off to the right there of that screen, some of the existing properties that front onto Bourne Road. They do form part of that sort of view back into the village from the public footpath. And then just coming on to one of the points in terms of the comments from the parish council that we'll pick up on. So the view from Old Post Lane, you can see, it's fairly difficult to see in this image, but you can see sort of the roofscape of the properties at the former timber yard sort of to the right here, and then some of the existing properties elsewhere in the village off to the left. And then just to give a bit of a flavour of the character of properties sort of immediately surrounding the site. So this is an example of properties on Stamford Road. You can see there's a mixture in terms of materials, sort of relationships with the road itself. And you've got a mix in terms of sort of two-storey and single-storey along this road. And then looking sort of examples of properties on Bourne Road, again, sort of quite a mixed character and materiality. So in terms of the site itself, as I say, the development is for a single plot, a two-storey dwelling. Dwelling would be to the east of the approved residential development and would be served via an extension of the existing access drive that currently serves that development. The property itself would be situated largely centrally within the plot, with the garage and studio positioned at that northern boundary. So you've got the plot here, and then you've got the triple garage and studio there. And then the eastern half of the site has been set aside to be paddock land. The proposed dwelling, as I say, would be a two-storey 5-bed property with an L plan form, traditional design, pitched roofing, gable-ended extension to the rear, and constructed with Stamford stone and red pan tiles to match the existing properties on the adjacent site. And then in terms of the floor plan, as I say, you can just see there the L plan form of the proposed property. And then the garage and studio, again, as I say, would be against the northern boundary and constructed in matching materials, and would have roof lights in that front elevation, which would be the south elevation facing in towards the proposed property, and a single first story light window on the left side elevation. So just as an indicative visual here to demonstrate, as I say, the dwelling would have private amenity space to the south, and as shown on the proposed site layout and on this visual, the existing boundary treatments are shown as being retained on the plans. So coming on to the key issues in this one, set out in full in the report, but the key issues in particular with this application are the principle of development and then the design quality and visual impact. So just picking up firstly in terms of principle of development, as I say, it's covered off significantly in the actual report itself, but primarily just picking up on the two reasons for refusal that were given for the previous application, which related to a lack of evidence of support from the local community and whether the actual scheme would meet a local need for housing. The applicant has now submitted results of a public survey exercise which has been carried out, which demonstrates that 80% of respondents to that survey supported the development. That survey itself comprised of 150 flyers being issued and 50 responses were received. Now, it's appreciated that the parish council have objected to the scheme and have raised concerns in terms of the adequacy of that survey and whether the the results provided are reliable and a true representation of public opinion. Officers have looked at the results of that survey, and the applicant has submitted the raw data for that online survey itself. And having looked at that information, officers are satisfied that on the balance of that evidence provided that the survey results are a fair representation and do effectively demonstrate that there is local support from the community. So taking the results of the survey coupled with the representations received, the general position taken by officers is that does demonstrate that there is support and there's not overwhelming objection in this case. And then in terms of meeting local housing needs, the applicant has submitted a housing survey, which demonstrates that there's a need for market housing within the village. Now, it's appreciated that there is a residential allocation off the Bourne Road in Closworth, which would deliver a significant amount of housing and include a mix of housing which is likely to meet this need. But also bearing in mind that the MPPF is a material consideration, recognises that the support given for windfall development and for small sites, and given that Closworth is an identified location for growth, it's considered that there is a proven need for housing that would be supported in this case. So just taking that as a whole, officer assessment is that it would accord with policy SP4 as a whole. And just to clarify in terms of the report itself, even though it's not specifically referenced, it does meet the provisions of criteria F in terms of meeting needs for essential infrastructure. Given that this is a small scale site, it's not one that meets the criteria in terms of the district council's policies for requiring financial contributions, etc. So it's very much in terms of related to the development itself and whether it meets those needs, and that is satisfactorily covered. As covered off in the report, it's appreciated that there is a conflict with the neighbourhood plan, which does support infill development only, but because there's a conflict between the restrictive nature of the neighbourhood plan only allowing infill development and our local plan does allow for consideration of edge of settlement sites, statutory provisions mean that the favour needs to be given to the provisions within the local plan over the conflict with the neighbourhood plan in this case. And then just coming on to design quality and visual impact. As I say, this application is a resubmission of a previously submitted scheme which was refused, which didn't include reasons for refusal for design. Now, it's appreciated that the parish council have raised objections in terms of design, scale and materials and whether the scheme would integrate with surrounding landscape. Officer assessment in this case is that it's largely going to be seen in the context of the approved development, and effectively it would be seen in the context of those properties and would fit in with the character that has been established by those properties, so that this scheme, this single plot in itself, wouldn't be out of character with what has already been established. So from an officer assessment, there is no objections on that basis. So just to bring it all together, as I say, the application proposals would accord with the development plan as a whole, and no material considerations to indicate that planning permission should be withheld. So the recommendation to the committee is that the Assistant Director of Planning is authorised to grant planning permission subject to the schedule of conditions set out with the main reports, with the revised conditions that have been included within the additional items report. And at that point, I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Adam. Can I call on Councillor David Bellamy, who's the ward councillor? Thank you. You have 3 minutes, David.
Thank you, Chairman.
1 moment, David. Harish?
Chairman, I believe ward councillor has got 5 minutes, not 3 minutes.
No, it has changed in the recent constitution to 3 minutes.
I beg your pardon.
Okay.
I'm going to read out the parish council's objection to this and why we're requesting that it's refused. But notwithstanding the survey which was done, what the parish council and I'm saying is that it does fail the test of SP4, particularly on D. So SP4D, but I'll read through the parish council comments on SP4. The design, scale and material used are not in keeping in character with the surrounding area, and the properties dominate the landscape on the edge of the settlement, particularly observed from Old Post Lane, and the picture really didn't do it justice that Adam showed. The additional application to the original 5 for a development on the edge of settlement of Colesworth is not substantially enclosed. There is no barrier to further growth, such as a road, and that is and it is visually extending building into the open countryside, as is stated in 2.3 of the local plan guidance, contrary to SP4D. It is not clear that it meets the proven local need for housing, particularly affordable, which the parish council are saying SP4, the extensions into open country are generally aimed at. Additional properties for reasons suggested above. So it is thought that the application does not meet the criteria to justify the additional property for the reasons suggested above. Parishioners are not clear that the contention, sorry, I'm reading the wrong bit. The need for larger upmarket properties is more than adequately met within Colesworth, and in this case within existing allocated site LVH4 Bourne Road and the site adjacent to the co-op. Basically what they're saying also is that a hedgerow doesn't provide a barrier to growth, particularly on this site to the north, where there's a smaller parcel of land between the Bourne Road houses and the also to the east, where you're going into open countryside. And indeed, even the paddock itself, it is part of the development. It is part of the red line to the east, and it does extend obtrusively into open countryside. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Any questions to David?
Councillor Bellamy, how much are these houses being marketed for? Because I know that the parish council touched on affordable, not needed affordable housing for the area.
I think the applicant who's going to speak might be able to answer that better, but I think
I think we could say that probably isn't a material consideration in this. They are larger detached houses. They're not aimed at the affordable housing market.
I think they are 700,000 or 800,000 anyway.
I think one of the other views is that there is some allocated land in Colesworth where there are allocations for affordable housing at the 30%. So, sorry.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And obviously I see at the spec that they're obviously quite large housing, but I was just picking up on what the parish council has said. Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much, David. If I can now call upon John Gibson from Hereford Homes, the applicant. If you could come, John, please, to where David was sitting. Thank you. Richard.
Sorry, on a point of order while we're waiting for the gentleman to move. Could I point out that section 6.7 of the rules of procedure state that questions can be asked of public speakers by the chairman, vice chairman or person providing, and not by individual members of the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, John. You have 3 minutes to speak. Thank you.
I'm
going to be brief because I think what's been said has covered most of the points. I'd just like to say that we're just trying to finish off the development with the 6th house, which is of a similar design to the 5 that have already been built. And there was a very high interest in those houses. We could have, sold many over. So there is clearly a local need for that type of product in that location. The way they have all been sold and 2 are now occupied. And I can't really add anything more to what Adam has said. So if there's any questions, I'm here really basically to answer any questions. The survey that was done was totally independent. We didn't get involved in it. It was agreed with the previous planning officer what needed to be done to cover off local need, and we kept out of it, and it was just totally independent, and we've not been involved in any of the investigation that's been done direct with the consultant involved to make sure it is totally impartial. That's all I'd like to say.
Thank you, John. Do the committee have any questions to the applicant? Phil?
Thanks, Madam Chairman. Thank you. I'm just aware of clearly Councillor Bellamy, as the ward councillor, one of his objections was that the developer has failed to carry out an appropriate, thorough and proportionate consultation as required by policy SP4. I just wondered if you could tell us what you have actually done to meet that requirement. Thank you.
Yeah, when we got the refusal for the first application, which we were a bit surprised at getting because we weren't aware of what needed to be done to satisfy local need. There had been some lesser support, which we thought was adequate, but clearly it wasn't. So we went back to say, what do we need to do? And apparently there wasn't a procedure in place to meet that requirement. So we suggested, do we just get an independent company involved to carry out a survey? And that was documented at the time that, yes, that was probably a way of satisfying the situation where there's a local policy been introduced, but it wasn't quite clear how that was to be actioned. So we basically put forward this company that do independent market research and market investigation like of this nature, and we got agreement up front exactly what would be done, and that was what happened, and the results were then provided, and it surprised us, but it showed an 80% support and a lot of positive comments about the quality of development that we've done for the 5 properties on the site already, and that great, another 6th property would fit in well with the village. So there was a lot of very positive feedback as well.
Any other questions? The applicant?
Madam Vice Chairman, can I just ask the applicant, are there, because I haven't done a site visit and not aware of the area, are the people actually living in the houses that have been built? And if so, would they have been included in the survey? Thank you.
They weren't included in the survey to participate. They were advised of what we were doing, but they weren't residents at the time. 2 have just been occupied, but none of the occupants are concerned about it because they're happy with the scheme, and they just see it as finishing off the scheme and actually giving an end to the development. We're only going to build 1 more. We're not going to do anything more. We've got an interested party in that 1 property that will be sold off. That will be the end of the development. And for the occupiers, that's more important because they know then it's going to be 1 quality home with a paddock. There's not going to be any more link roads to anything else. That is the end of the development. And that suits them to know they've got certainty what's going to happen with that parcel of land, which is part of the original site. So it was all part of that original site ownership. And they're all keen to see 1 more quality home with a paddock being built on that site. And then that will be it. We'll be off and we'll be away.
Thank you.
Councillor Harris Bisnell,
Thank you, Madam Chairman, through you. Will it be possible for you to tell us, because I see according to our documents here, you put boxes in places in the town, and the total number of leaflets that you received back that were duly filled was only 75. I believe. Yeah.
Sorry,
believe-
I didn't get involved. You know, this was the important thing, and this was what was communicated with the planning officer at the time. We weren't involved in it. We didn't get agreed to what were to be done. That was agreed between the past planning officer and the marketing company. We didn't put any leaflets out ourselves. We didn't do any of the collection. We weren't involved. I don't honestly know. I know 150 leaflets were passed around. There was drops. There was a collection point in the pub that I was aware of, but we weren't involved, and we didn't want to be involved because at no point we want to be said, look, it's not independent. So I can only say that I know that the company said they put out 150. They produced up front that was agreed with the planning officer where those would be, which was the 150 nearest houses to the development. And the results were done, and the results were passed to the planning officer. And then the investigation was done direct between the planning officer and that company. We've kept out of it altogether.
Thank you very much, John, for answering that. I think Case Officer Adam would like to just come in with some information.
Yeah, so just to provide a bit of guidance in terms of that, because of the sort of the wording of SP4A in terms of what it says about substantial community support, that doesn't necessarily provide a clear criteria of what that entails and what is required to meet that requirement. Now, the advice that officers give through pre-application and give to applicants is effectively what we want to see through those exercises is essentially evidence that the applicant has consulted with neighbouring properties and has publicised the development within any effect. Is very much commensurate on the scale of the scheme itself. So it's advertising it to neighbouring properties, advertising it widely within the village, and making sure it's been advertised for a period of at least 21 days. Now, in this case, what happened, it was between the former case officer and I think as John has alluded to there, the actual independent company that carried it out. But essentially, it was properties along Bourne Road, Stamford Road. I think I do in fact have a. Yeah, so just for members' information then, so on the screen, what we've got is an image here of the flyer that was sent out to residents. So it provides a plan showing the site itself and the site plan as has now been submitted to us, and provides details then in terms of where respondents can get in touch. So it's given an opportunity here for respondents to answer sort of by posting that questionnaire. There was a letterbox effectively put in a pub, which was allowing people to provide responses anonymously that way, or alternatively, people could provide responses online. As I understand it, there was 150 flyers that were issued, and the area that was agreed is the area shown in red here. And from that, then 50 responses were received, of which 40 showed support for the scheme and 10 showed objection to the scheme. Now, as I say, the applicant has then provided the raw data from that. I believe from that, of those 50 responses, I think about 46, 47 were online. The case officers then scrutinised those results, looking at them, and it has shown that they've come from effectively individual online sort of respondents, rather than say sort of a generic computer sort of robot generating responses to this survey. Now, we can't pinpoint looking at that data exactly who has responded, where they have responded, etc. Obviously, that information isn't available. But then in terms of the way that officers then balance that judgment, we've taken what that survey shows and how that meets sort of what we feel is proportionate, and balance that again in terms of our own consultation that we do as part of the application process, and whether sort of the level of objection is received or the level of comments received on the application would provide evidence that that isn't reliable, that there is clearly an alternative view in place. Now, I think it said on the report, what we got here was 3 public representations raising objection to it, which haven't taken sort of a balanced view, taking things in the round doesn't clearly show that there is a clear overwhelming objection, sort of that would suggest that that evidence provided by the applicant isn't a fair reflection of public sort of public views within the village. Does that help answer your question, councillor?
Not quite. No. Thanks ever so much for your reply anyway. But I would really, going back to SB4, it should is substantial support from the local community. And I would say the community is far outnumber. How many we got over? I think it's over 1,600 people, I would say, immediate local community. To that 50 doesn't quite represent, because when I was there, I've been talking to people there. Many of the people, their concerns were they would far rather see affordable homes there for people that really needs, that's what the community needed, not these big houses that is there. So I will not prejudice myself against that, but I would say you would agree with me that this is not a substantial support, to support this application.
Thank you, Harish. We'll go into debate later on and ask further questions. Councillor Ian Selby.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice Chairman. Through the chair, with reference to the paddock land that is to the north of the site, I believe there's a public footpath goes through that particular field. Could you just confirm that that doesn't go through your site in question or has any impact upon that? And also, just while I'm speaking, Madam Chairman, I took the opportunity as a matter of courtesy to go and view the site a couple of days ago. And I have to say that the 5 buildings that's already been built, the workmanship is absolutely excellent in my view. So compliment on that.
Thank you. Adam, do you wish to answer the footpath question?
Yeah, I can answer on the footpath. Yeah, so the footpath runs to the north from Bourne Road to the north of the site through that sort of paddock field land there. And then there is a stile crossing sort of at the southeastern corner so it doesn't cross through the application site itself, and then runs sort of further to the east of the site, sort of diagonally to that neighbouring sort of agricultural field. So yeah, there's no sort of involvement with the application site.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you, John. You're relieved. There are no other speakers, so we can now move to further questions to the case officer. Councillor Ian Stokes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, the village boundary where the houses on the curtilage, is this inside or outside the village curtilage? Because unfortunately, we've not had a site visit, which I would have liked as a committee on this one.
So it is a scheme that we're assessing against SP4, so the edge of settlement policy. Now, councillor, you appreciate we don't have strict village boundaries drawn per se. So when we're looking at proposals, it is a matter of judgment effectively as to whether it's sort of SP3, SP4, or whether it's then open countryside. This one, having looked at the actual characteristics of the site itself, it's felt that is more representative of an edge of settlement site as opposed to open countryside. So that's why it's considered against SP4 in this case.
Thank you for that non-answer.
Councillor Harish.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I would really like to ask for something to be included on page 25. On pressure under item 7.10.2, with regards to, I do appreciate that SB1 and SD1 has been taken into considerations on that. I wonder if it is possible to include grey water recycling systems to be implemented within the thing, as to fully complement the climate change. And probably and condition it on page 31, item 6, if that could be added grey water recycling at the end of the charging point.
I think on that point, councillor, I don't think it's a specific policy requirement that we have for grey water recycling. Now, we do have sort of the actual policy test in SB1, which refer to electric car charging, etc., and how the building itself has been developed to minimise carbon emissions and has been developed to meet water efficiency standards, but that doesn't specifically require them to do anything in terms of grey water recycling.
Should we not take that into consideration as part of the climate change, that now we are in a drought seasons where hose pipe are banned, so we have to use our water more wisely?
Certainly appreciate obviously the sentiment that you're raising, councillor, but I'd suggest that's probably something in terms of reviewing the policy mechanism itself as opposed to being done through the development management process. That would be something that I think in terms of we're going through a local plan review at the moment, and it's probably something that would be appropriate to go through that process and have that introduced into it as a policy obligation. We as development management and as the committee, we can only assess the scheme in terms of what the local plan obligations are as they stand at the moment.
Will it be possible if that could be approached to the developer, if he could, probably it's a very simple system to implement, I would say it doesn't cost that much, if that could be done as being the first?
It's something obviously we can ask the question, but we can't certainly enforce it to them. And as a committee today, what we're being asked to do is judge the acceptability of the scheme in front of us as it stands. And as I say, the policy requirements at the minute do not specifically require them to do that. So again, we can ask the question, but as a planning authority, we can't enforce them to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further questions to the officer? Judy?
Yes, I'm just interested in the conflict between the neighbourhood plan and this application, really. If you could just,
Yeah, so the adopted neighbourhood plan was one of the earlier neighbourhood plans that were adopted in the district and came forward and was made before our most recent local plan was adopted. So that was essentially based on what the old core strategy and the development management policies were at that time. Now, that neighbourhood plan allows additional residential development, but specifically refers to infill development being acceptable only. Now, since then, we've adopted the local plan, and the local plan is not necessarily quite so narrow. It does allow for consideration of edge of settlement sites, etc., and then has the policies in terms of open countryside as well. So because there is a conflict between the neighbourhood plan, which only allows infill development, and then our local plan, which also allows the local planning authority to consider edge of settlement sites, there's a conflict between those two policies. And what the statutory legislation is, so in terms of the usual legislation that we have, say in accordance with the development plan, etc., what that says is where you have policies that are conflicting within the development plan, what you should do is essentially weigh that up in favour of the policy that was the last to be adopted. So in this case, because the local plan was adopted after the neighbourhood plan was made, the allowance for edge of settlement sites in our local plan would take sort of stronger weighting or take precedence over the neighbourhood plan, which only allows infill development. Has that hopefully made it? It's one of those things that, yeah, potentially not easy to sort of make sound straightforward, but yeah, that's essentially sort of what the situation is with legislation, etc.
I understand what you're saying, I understand that, but of course the neighbourhood plan would have passed a referendum, whereas the local plan wouldn't. So, yeah, anyway.
Yeah, and I think that's obviously why it's important then when these sort of documents and neighbourhood plans and local plans, etc., are made, that it's important for them to be reviewed, etc., and made sure that they're updated to take on account, obviously, in this case, those changes in the local plan. I'm sure, obviously, that the neighbourhood plan is probably in the process of being reviewed at the moment, or I'm sure the parish council are probably looking at that. And it's probably, again, something that they're looking at in terms of locally, how do they want to address that?
Thank you. Any more questions for the officer? We can move on into debate. Who would like to start debating further? No? Councillor Harris?
Yes, yes, Madam Chairman, I would very much like to know the differential, but I'm still not satisfied with the reason given under SP4 for the edge of settlement development. Why is this being, or is being recommended for it to be approved for it? That if it does not quite chime in with the parish's local plan, and the parish's council itself is in opposition to this, why are we not taking that as a material reason?
Thank you, if I may. So the neighbourhood plan was adopted in 2017. The council's local plan was adopted in 2020. So it's the council's development plan in terms of the local plan that takes primacy in that regard. If there's any conflict, you must follow the local plan, not the neighbourhood plan. And that's because of the age, because perhaps not explaining myself clearly enough. Local plans and development plan, sorry, let me start again. Neighbourhood plans must be in consistency with the plans that come above them. So a new neighbourhood plan, like the Stamford plan that we've just adopted, is in consistency with our local plan. The issue here is the neighbourhood plan came before our current local plan. So it's a local plan you follow and give the most weight to. The other could be regarded as out of date. So I'm sorry, you need to follow the local plan policy.
Yes, sorry to interrupt. Just to echo that, there's legal authority that says that if there's conflict between two local planning policies, whether that be under the local plan or the neighbourhood plan, as Emma says, you must follow the most recent policy, which has already been adopted and found sound, which in this case is the local plan rather than the neighbourhood plan.
Can I come back, please, Madam Chairman? So I'm a bit confused in that because parish council normally they cannot review their plan every 4 years. What you are saying, so every 4 years the parish council should review their local plan or the neighbourhood plan, or is because our plan is going on now to probably 2041, the new one. But in that case, so the neighbourhood plan for the parish council, if they are only off by a few months, it doesn't become material considerations in any planning applications. They are always superseded by the local plan.
So it's still a material consideration, but where you've got conflict between different policies, you must give the greater weight to the newest policy. And we are required to determine in accordance with development plan. So you have to give greater weight to and follow what the local plan says where there is a conflict. If there's no conflict, you're not rendering any of your policies out of date. So for example, a previous case, I've had heritage policies not quite in conformity with the framework, but they didn't say anything too different. So you don't argue that they're out of date because they're broadly in consistency with the framework. So here, if the policies in the neighbourhood plan that were 2017 are the same as the policies in our current up-to-date local plan, you've got no issue. It's where there's that inconsistency or that conflict between the two, you have to go with the newer policy, and the newer policy is in the local plan that was adopted in 2020.
Any other debate?
Thank you. I'm still not too impressed with the boundary situation. You know, this is sort of extending the boundary of the village, curtilage. Unfortunately, I suspected that this should have been applied for when the 5 houses were applied for initially. And then it would probably have been all approved at that time or all refused. I do remember a case years ago when we had this sort of problem on the boundary of another village. And it was clear I was in the chair at the time and made a right mess of it. So I'm always concerned about this. But it seems a nice development. The plans that we've seen are absolute rubbish, the site plan. And certainly think we should have actually all visited so we could see how it fitted in the village itself. I'm unsure as to which way to go on this one. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we could have some further advice from Adam because the previous application was refused, and at appeal, it was refused on 2 grounds of SP4. And this is a resubmission to give evidence that those 2 grounds have now been complied with. So one was the survey and one is local need. There are other factors in SP4, like extending obtrusively into the open countryside. That wasn't considered to be a valid objection at the time. That doesn't mean to say you don't think otherwise, but we have got a situation that Adam will try and explain.
I think Penny, you've nearly hit the nail on the head there. So yeah, as you say, we've got this is essentially a replication of the previous application that we had. Now that previous application was refused on the basis that there wasn't clear evidence of substantial support from the local community, and there wasn't clear evidence that it met a proven need for market housing. So there's those 2 points. So it's criteria A and then criteria E of policy SP4 that application was refused on. Now, because that application was refused solely on that basis, when we're making decisions as the local planning authority, we are legally obliged to list all reasons for refusal that we may have. So even if we have an objection in principle to a scheme, say in terms of SP4 as an example, we are required as a planning authority to list all of the criteria within that policy that it doesn't accord with. So the fact that in this case, the previous decision, I appreciate that was a delegated decision taken by officers rather than by the committee, only referenced criteria A and criteria E of that policy. If members now felt, judging the application in front of them today, that there was conflicts with other elements of policies within the local plan other than those 2 criteria, the emphasis on members then would be to demonstrate what has materially changed between the previous application that was determined by officers and then the application that is in front of you today as members. And as I say, in terms of the actual site plan itself, in terms of the actual property itself, that is effectively a resubmission of that same dwelling. All that's different between that application and this application is the additional evidence that's now been submitted to try and cover off those 2 policy requirements.
Thank you, Adam. I think that explains the situation that we're in quite clearly. So whilst some of us might think that extending obtrusively into the open countryside is a factor, we are rather committed to the previous refusal notice, unfortunately. And it's really for us to decide, I would have thought at this meeting, whether A and E, which were in the reasons for refusal, have now been satisfactorily addressed. And so A was the support from the local community and E was the local housing need. So any extra debate on that? Councillor Phil Dilks.
Madam Chairman, if it's helpful, I think we're kind of going around in circles here, and I'd be very happy to propose a motion, if that is helpful to you, that we accept the recommendation of the officer in this case and that it is approved. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Richard, I'm terribly sorry, but you and Harish left the room in the middle of questions and debate, so I'm afraid you can't take any further part. I do apologise to both of you.
Sorry, whilst we're on that, I think Councillor Reid, you didn't hear, so you can't pay it. Can I just remind councillors that it is in the Code of Conduct, if you leave the room during or arrive after the debate or the presentation from the officers has started, you are not permitted to take part in the vote on particular items. So if you do desperately need to leave, it might be preferable if you can't hang on to us for a short adjournment and we can deal with it in that way. Thank you.
I can't see a seconder for this proposal. I can understand.
To get this motion through, I'll second fells because it seems we're getting nowhere without.
Yes, I can understand the frustration, believe me. And I think, we need perhaps more conversations on these issues, but today we are just judging this application as it is. So we have a proposer to approve, seconded. Any more? So I think we can go to the vote on that to approve this application. Against? Abstain?
Motion carried then, 3-4-0 against and 2 abstentions.
We'll now move on to the next agenda item, which is agenda item 5, and David Bellamy will come back into the chair.
Hello, everybody. We'll have a comfort break now for 10 minutes. Yep, 10 minutes, please. So about 2:05, please. Okay, everybody, we'll move on to agenda item 5. And presenting this is Phil Jordan, please.
Thank you, Chairman, and good afternoon, members. The next item relates to the Mallard Pass Solar Farm. Just to start with, just to outline, this is a different to the normal applications that we would consider at this planning committee, in that it's a nationally significant infrastructure project. And what that means in simple terms is that it's of such a scale that we aren't responsible for determining the application should it come forward. At this stage, the proposals are still at the pre-application stage and are still being shaped and refined. If the applicant follows through and submits an application, they'd be required to submit an application for a development consent order, and that application would be ultimately determined by the Secretary of State, and it would follow a period of examination which is conducted by the Planning Inspectorate. I'll let the plans describe the location as opposed to a few words that are on the screen. So the next slide, I'm not sure how well members can see the information there, but the next couple of slides, I really just wanted to outline a bit about the process and where we currently are with the process. Members will appreciate this is as far as I know, this is the first project of this scale, a nationally significant infrastructure project where we've been the host authority. And so to a large extent, the process is new territory. We have been involved as a consultee with different types of projects, but nationally significant infrastructure projects in adjoining areas. But this is the first time that the proposal's been directly within South Kesteven. So just on the side here, that this timeline is from the applicant's consultation documents. And it's really quite a high level timeline that highlights the pre-application activities that have taken place to date. And towards the top of the timeline is a stage 1 consultation, which is outside of the statutory process, but that allowed for some early consultation with consultees such as ourselves, but also with members of the public, and that took place towards the end of 2021. What followed after that earlier on in this year was a application to the Planning Inspectorate for a scoping opinion. That's a formal part of the project for environmental impact assessment, which seeks to agree the scope of any environmental statement which would be submitted with the proposal. And so what that does is it covers the areas where there's likely to be significant effects and the scope of how those particular topic areas are going to be assessed and reviewed. There was then a consultation directly with us around something called a statement of community consultation. And what that is it's a statutory part of the process, and it's a requirement on the applicant to put together a document that sets out how they're going to carry out consultation. So it talks about who they would consult with, which groups they would consult with, where the consultation activities would take place, the statutory consultees in the process, but there's also local experts such as the Lincolnshire Heritage Trust who would be the relevant expert for archaeology. So that happened earlier on this year. We're now in this, we've come to the end of this stage 2 consultation, and this is again a statutory requirement on the applicant to carry out a formal consultation prior to submitting the development consent order. what they have to do is they have to carry out that consultation in accordance with the statement of community consultation that's already been agreed. And further on in the process, as a local planning authority, we're asked to formally comment on the adequacy of the consultation that's taken place. As part of the application for the development consent order, one of the things the applicant has to do is set out all the responses and points that were raised during the statutory consultation and set out how they've responded to them or sort of shape the proposals to address the points that have been raised. The next slide goes a bit further and it highlights the role that we have as a local authority in the development consent order process. So this column here on the left, these are all the pre-application activities. And just to remind members, this is where we are at the moment. Following this statutory consultation, the applicant has set out that they intend to submit the application for the development consent order by the end of this year. One of the documents refers to a date at the end of November. The first part of that assessment process then is whether or not the examining authority are going to accept the application. And part of that is that important document around the adequacy of consultation that's taken place. So have they done what they said they were going to do in the statement of community consultation, and have they responded to the points raised satisfactorily? There then follows some pre-examination activities. There's then a formal examination period, which there are various key points that us as a local authority would have to contribute to. One of those is producing a local impact report, and that's the opportunity for us to set out as a local authority what we consider the local impacts of the proposal to be. At the end of that examination, the examining authority is required to put forward a recommendation, and then, as I said, it's the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy that ultimately takes the decision. There then are various post-decision activities, and this would assume that the consent order was granted, and as a local authority we can have a role in things like the conditions and compliance with the conditions thereafter. As I set out earlier, this is new territory to us as a local planning authority, so there's a lot of information out there that to look up the process, and there are other local authorities close by which have been through the process to a conclusion. But as things are at the moment in South Stephen, this would be the first development consent order process that we've been through. So I've got a couple of slides showing an overview of the proposal. I'll probably use this one to highlight some of the key components of the scheme, and then I've got another slide which is a bit more detailed, and it might be preferential to refer back to that if we need to for any discussions. But what we've got here around just to sort of orientate members, running through the middle of the slide here, this is the East Coast Main Line. Broadly dissects the site in two. Just where my cursor is on the screen here, this is the north of Stamford. And then these boxes around the outside, if you look in the consultation documents, they're quite helpful in describing some of the changes that have been made to the proposals to date, but they're a bit unhelpful because they cover up some of the settlements. But what you can see on here is you've got Carlby to the north of the site, Braceborough, which where my cursor is, Uffington down to the south of the site here. Over in this direction, you've got Gretford in South Kesteven, Essendine, which is in Rutland, and Ryle, which is in Rutland as well. What you've got on the screen, there's a yellow dot. I'm going to move so I can actually see the screen here. The yellow blob where the cursor is highlights the existing Ryle electricity substation. Just to north of that, there's a larger area that's highlighted in orange, and that highlights the area of the proposed solar farms substation. The area on the screen, which is, I guess, depending on your eyesight, it's a light blue or a grey colour. This highlights where the proposed areas of the solar arrays would be. So that's I think most members are familiar with how a solar farm's laid out. It's the large areas you see of solar panels laid onto frames. You've then got two green areas, which you've got sort of slightly darker green and a lighter green. The darker green highlights existing bits of woodland and hedgerows that have to be retained, and then the lighter green colour is areas which are within the red line but have been set aside for mitigation measures. You then have sort of lines that sort of spurred off from the main part of the site, and there are some roads that are highlighted within the red line, and they've been included because some of the construction mitigation measures require improvements or widening to these roads, and so it's relevant to consider them or include them within the red line. Again, I won't dwell on this slide. It's effectively shows the same thing, but it's the proposals overlaid onto a existing satellite map. So where we are and what we're being asked to do at the moment, this is a stage 2 consultation. What's been put forward is a document called a preliminary environmental information report. Anyone who's looked at that in its entirety, it's a long document. There is a non-technical summary that sits alongside it. And what that does is it covers various environmental topic areas where there's likely to be effects from the proposed development. What it is it's a sort of an early iteration of what will ultimately be an environmental statement that will be required to be submitted with the application for the development consent order. Not every single one of the topics is shown on the screen there, but I've tried to pick out the ones which are probably most relevant and where the effects in some areas are likely to be significant. So we've got landscape and visual, ecological and biodiversity impacts, cultural heritage and archaeology, access and highways, noise and vibration, air quality impacts, water source, resources, ground conditions, agricultural land use, the climate change effects of the proposal, and then cumulative impacts, which again, I'll talk about that a bit more on the next couple of slides. So where we are with this stage 2 consultation, as I've said earlier, it's required to be carried out in accordance with the agreed statement of community consultation. And further into the process, we'll be asked to formally comment on the adequacy of the consultation that's been undertaken. The environmental information report has been developed following that formal scoping opinion from the planning inspectorate. And as I said, will be further refined to inform ultimately what will be the environmental statement necessary to be submitted with the application. As I've said already, it's a lengthy document. It's a technical document, and the applicant has produced various sort of summaries, consultation booklets, which summarize the information into more easily readable and digestible information. I think it's important to say that what's very different from this process is that our normal role as a local planning authority would be to be in charge of the consultation activities, and what we would do is usually seek to summarise the consultation responses, make sure the consultation responses are responded to, and then we effectively balance out all those sometimes competing interests before making a recommendation. It's slightly different in this case in that we are just being consulted as the local authority. The consultation activities extend to numerous individuals, groups, but also other statutory consultees such as Rutland County Council, Lincolnshire County Council, and as I've already mentioned, some of those locally important or expert groups like the Heritage Trust in respect of archaeology. So just to be clear that whilst our response hasn't focused on some issues such as flood risk and highways impacts, that's not us as a local authority expressing our satisfaction of those areas. It's just that we would consider or we would defer to the expertise of those statutory bodies that we would normally be required to consult with. And at an officer level, what we've been doing is working closely with planners at Lincolnshire County Council and planners at Rutland County Council to make sure that we've got a coordinated approach to engaging with the applicants, but as far as possible as well, trying not to avoid duplication on some of the matters. It is appropriate at this stage that consultation comments are made directly to the applicant, and that's been done. And within the cover report, I did highlight some of the key sort of material considerations that have been raised by the public as part of the consultation, where they've copied us into their responses. As I said earlier, the applicant does then have a legal obligation, a statutory duty to respond to all of those points that have been raised. So it isn't necessary for us to duplicate all the comments made by the public or other consultation bodies. They will need to be addressed by the applicant in their submission for the development consent order. What we have done, we've focused a technical review of that preliminary environmental information report and engaged independent experts, Stantec. Members may recall it's the same sort of organisation that we used for the downtown independent work, and they're a large multidisciplinary planning consultancy, and within that they have the ability to pick up various areas of expertise. And what we requested from them jointly with Rutland County Council was an overall technical review of that preliminary environmental information report, which is included at Appendix A. And we also asked for a more detailed review and critique of two of the areas which we consider and are actually highlighted by the applicant as areas where there's likely to be significant effects. One of those being the landscape and visual impacts, and the second being the agricultural land use topic. As a very high level overview, as officers, we accept, and I think it's important to recognise the benefits associated with renewable energy production. Members of this committee, some will have been involved and aware that we have recently granted planning permission for 2 large-scale solar farms to the north of Grantham, and I think it's relevant to say that both local policy and national policy broadly support and understand the benefits of such renewable energy schemes, both in terms of climate change and also in terms of that ability to produce renewable energy. What I would say, though, to balance that out, is that the scale of this proposal is unparalleled in terms of existing operational solar sites within the UK. It's significantly larger than anything that's currently on the ground at the moment. To give an idea of comparison, the way the schemes are effectively benchmarked is the output, or the electrical output, and the total amount or the highest electrical output we can deal with as a local planning authority is 50 megawatts. And the proposal for this scheme is 350 megawatts. So those 2 schemes that I talked about north of Grantham were at the upper end of what we can deal with as a local planning authority. Really, that's come about. Sorry, what I will say is whilst there aren't any solar farms of this scale currently on the ground, there's a number of very large scale solar farms that are currently under consideration or at pre-application stage, the same as this. Several within Lincolnshire, and that's why it's been helpful engaging with colleagues at Lincolnshire County Council who've got more of an overview than us on some of those other schemes within Lincolnshire. Just as a bit of background, my interpretation of what's happened is the current national planning policy statements don't explicitly refer to solar farm developments, but at the moment there's been published these draft national policy statements, and EN3, which is one of those, specifically has a chapter and a section in there around large scale solar. And my interpretation is it's off the back of that draft national policy statement, which is why some of these larger scale than we've dealt with previously as a local planning authority schemes have come forward. I think talking then about the impacts, as I've said, whilst we accept the benefits and understand what's supported, I think it is important to recognise that as you increase the scale of these things, typically so then do the impacts increase as well. And at this stage, it's felt relevant to focus on what those key impacts are, in order that further down the line, when it comes to making any decisions around the acceptability of the scheme overall, or balancing out what those benefits are versus any harm, what is absolutely imperative is that we're able to fully understand what those impacts are to support being able to make any robust conclusions. The independent expert reviews that we've commissioned have highlighted a number of concerns with the surveys and the information that's been put forward to date. The cover report highlights some of the key points that have been raised. Again, I appreciate they are quite technical in nature, and that's largely down to the technical nature of the subject matter, and certainly outside the scope of our own technical expertise as officers. And it's why it's been important for us to engage that expert advice from that independent consultancy. The recommendation that's put forward is effectively to endorse the draft response that's set out in towards the end of the report in sections 7.2 to 7.8. Just to highlight what that does include, I believe it's at 7.6. I'll just read 7.6 in its entirety. SKDC requests that the environmental statement submitted with any formal development consent order application for this proposal fully takes account of the concerns and recommendations raised within those reports. So effectively what we're asking to be endorsed is the three reports and the recommendations with them in their entirety. And I think, as I said already, just as the intention would be that we would write a cover letter that would be the formal response of the council and include those three reports as appendices. Just one other point, if it's not been clear through the presentation or through the written report, we would also seek to highlight the fact, the point I made earlier, that where we've been silent on matters such as flood risk, highways, archaeology, we would effectively ask that the applicant defers to those experts or statutory consultees that we would normally refer to if this was an application that we were determining. So, for example, the lead local flood authority and the local highway authority being Lincolnshire County Council. Thank you, Chairman. That's the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Phil. I will move on to the speakers. First speaker is District Ward Councillor Rosemary Trollope-Bellew, please. You have 3 minutes, Rosemary. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. And committee for allowing me to speak to you today as one of the District Ward Councillors for Keswick Ward, which will be affected by the 2,175 acre site called the Mallard Pass Solar Farm. I understand that the process for dealing with this is not quite the same as for conventional applications, and that SKDC is not the decision maker on the final application because of the scale and the solar farm, and that the planning inspector will hold an examination and the discussion will be made by the inspector. As local member for Gretford and Banthorpe, Barham and Stowe, Uffington and Keswick and Newstead, Tallington, Baston and Langtoft, plus clerk to Bracebury and Wilsthorpe Parish Council, I feel that the residents I represent should have their voices of objection heard and reasons why they feel so strongly. I received a large number of emails of objection for stage one, which took place in 2021, but have received over 200 for the second consultation. The main objections remain the same as the first: visual impact and effect on wildlife, flooding concerns, particularly in the parish of Gretford, scale and size of the development, HGV routing agreement for both construction, traffic, and once the site is completed, which would have an impact on the villages and its residents, and concern over how the routing agreement would be policed, and especially concern over the use of good quality agricultural land. Under the government guideline, Gregory Barker's speech in 2013, he said, "Solar is rightly popular, but if we aren't careful, or if the sector expands inappropriately, then invaluable popular support will slip through our fingers. We don't want solar to become a bone of public contention like offshore wind." He also said that we need to be careful that we do not over-insensitize large-scale ground-mounted projects in appropriate places. I am thinking of greenfield agricultural land that would generate strong opposition to our community energy agenda. It needs careful design and thoughtful consideration. It certainly could not be a scheme about renewable energy at any cost. Where solar farms are not on brownfield site, you must be looking at low-grade agricultural land, which works with farmers to allow grazing in parallel with regeneration.
30 seconds.
Oh, crikey, that was quick. I could go on, but obviously, with the review that you did through Rutland County Council and South Kestland District Council, it showed that 50% of the proposed site was grade 2 or grade 3A, the other being grade 3B and a small amount of grade 4, which is very poor quality land. This shows that half the proposed site is best and most versatile agricultural land as defined by the 1988 Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, which is now called DEFRA. Therefore, Chairman and committee, I understand that SKDC does not have all the information it requires, which is why it is a holding objection. But I urge you and the planning officers to consider the strong feelings of objections and your own renewable energy strategy to continue to object to this application when it is presented. We need to look at our country's food security.
Sorry, councillor.
Consideration our residents' wishes and look at the impact on our rural communities and encourage the government and building firms to incorporate more renewable energy into new builds such as housing estates and to be looking at more brownfield sites,
Councillor
commercial
Bellew.
industries.
Thank
you very much, Chairman.
Intervene there, sorry. So
That was a quick 3 minutes.
I will allow a little bit of leeway for the other speakers as well. Thank you. Next speaker, councillor Virginia.
Allow questions or not?
Do you want to ask the ward councillor? Rosemary, are you able to answer a question, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Councillor Troy-Ballew, thank you for your presentation. I just wondered if you felt that the main objections could be overcome with further mitigation in the application. And forgive me, I couldn't quite hear, and perhaps an opportunity for you to say again, the person who you're quoting, I didn't quite sort of hear who it was and when it was.
It was 2014 and it was Gregory Barker.
Ah, right. My point there would be, but that was nearly 10 years ago, 9 years ago, clearly before the emergency we have currently, where people are facing quadruple bills in their energy costs. I'll just leave it at that for now, but thank you.
Councillor Moran, please.
Thank you. I represent the ward next along from where this development is to take place. I've lost count of how many people I've spoken to. I'm not going to deal with specifics. I just want to give you an overall view, which appears to be echoed by all the people I speak to. If not now, when are we actually going to commit to doing something about the climate and emergency crisis? There has got to come a point where we actually start supporting initiatives such as Mallard Pass. It's all well and good governments pledging, oh, we'll aim for 2040 or 2050. That is simply too late. Right now is when we actually have to start to do something for our children and our grandchildren. We can't keep putting it off. Let's face it, with the greatest of respect, the vast majority of people in this room will be dead and gone by 2050. We can't keep saying, but my house, my view. There's come a time where they have to say, sod it. That is the price I will pay for this county, this country and this planet to survive. I'm not being alarmist. This generation is entirely responsible for the state this planet is in simply by putting things off. I can hear some of you saying, oh, we're just one tiny area in a small county, in a little country. What about China, India, Russia, the United States, remedies to global catastrophe of our climate and energy production simply has to start somewhere. We can't wait for everyone to board the bus. It's leaving right now. I've also heard some of the objections, but what about the crops we'll lose? If all of this land was top grade land that was producing mountains of wheat or barley or turnips or whatever, that would possibly be a valid point, but it's not, and it doesn't. We're still importing food from abroad while our crops die in the field. They should put them on factory roofs and new houses. Yeah, lovely thought, but we can't, can we? There's simply no legislation available to planning authorities to insist that developers are forced to do this. It's actually very disappointing to read in the local news that this council is set to issue a blanket objection to this proposal, and the leader has endorsed that view on social media.
30 seconds.
Rather than a blanket objection, shouldn't we be doing a blanket support subject to further information being received? If you vote against this proposal, will you go home tonight and think, yes, today I did a good thing? I don't think you will. Thank you.
Thank you, councillor Moran. Councillor Ashley Baxter, please. When you're ready, councillor Baxter, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, for allowing me this opportunity to speak to the committee this afternoon, and good afternoon, committee. As county councillor for the area and as district ward member for the neighbouring ward, I've been copied into a lot of correspondence about this proposal, and it's in some ways refreshing to get such a large amount of correspondence about the impending catastrophe of climate change, about the war in Ukraine, about the cost of living crisis, about the energy cost inflation that we're all suffering at the moment, and even about human rights. And all this attention is focused on almost laser-like on one small corner of Middle England and of Lincolnshire and Rutland. Actually, the area represents less than 1/10 of 1% of the agricultural area in those two counties, Lincolnshire and Rutland. All developments of this size have a visual impact and affect agricultural land use. We face applications soon of 60,000 trees facing the chop at Prince William of Gloucester Barracks from a Homes England application. The Garden Village near Grantham will undoubtedly affect the countryside, the Stamford North development and various housing developments. Indeed, the development you've just passed has an effect on agriculture in the countryside. This application is actually a 40-year temporary construction. Who knows what will happen at the end of that? Certainly, if you build houses in the same way, they're permanent, they're there forever. I completely understand that people are fearful of what is going to happen what may happen on their doorstep and about the way that it is being done. And I appreciate the people who have got in touch with me about it. I also appreciate the changes that the applicants have made to the plans after the first consultation. But having listened to the applicants and the objectors, on balance, I think that in principle, we should be supporting applications like this and this one too. When built, the noise from this development would be negligible, probably less than the current noise from agriculture. Traffic, when built, there will be negligible traffic, probably similar to the agriculture at the moment. The flooding would be no worse nor better. I've seen no evidence to suggest that this would make flooding worse. Not to say that flooding isn't a problem in the area, but it wouldn't make matters worse. Biodiversity, within 3 years, there will be better biodiversity, not just because herbicide and pesticide will no longer be used on those fields. For 30 seconds, crumbs. So a lot more to say about deer and pedestrian access and so on. Some of it positive. Alternative brownfield sites are desirable, but in SKDC, we're simply not delivering. We've just handed back £1 million to central government, which was earmarked for energy measures by this council. We've allowed developers in Market Deeping to renege on the promise of roof-mounted solar for technical reasons. We have a climate emergency, block capitals, emergency facing our world. So by all means, make recommendations for adjustments, enhancements, improvements, as in paragraph 7.8, but to stand foursquare against a scheme which would provide renewable energy equivalent to the needs of all the households of SKDC and Rutland put together would be a mistake. If not here, where? If not now, when?
Thank you, councillor Baxter. I believe councillor Cook is next.
Lovely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been quite a while since I've come to a planning committee to speak. So I think in terms of where I'd like to start, and I know obviously it's a technical report for Mallard Pass, and the first thing I would like to say is, in response to Councillor Moran's comment, is I do look forward to being here in 2050. It's one of the first things. No, I am not against the use of renewable energy across our district, and I think there is certainly a place and a location for it to go. Now, the challenges that we have with this application, and I've been fortunate of representing this area for the last 12 years alongside Councillor Rosemary Trollope-Bellew, is that it is a fantastic area for our local residents. It is very much valued by all of our local villagers. But we've got to look at some of the issues that this application is going to deliver to us. We know we have issues with food security, and we know we're going to have challenges into the future, and this will do nothing to support our agricultural sector moving into the future. The solution to me is not by covering our lands and agricultural land, and there's still question marks over some of the land qualifications in this site as to what qualification it is, and also contradicting government guidance in terms of the higher quality areas of this land. I know some of the conversations residents have had with me is in terms of the technology and actually the solar actually being that proven technology in terms of actually reaching those figures of power generation. I just do not believe the information that we are being sent in terms of how much power that site will be able to generate. I've already mentioned the aesthetic beauty of our district and history. This application, and I have said this to the developers as well along the way, the application has been poor to date. The maps were poor quality. The details that were sent out to local residents, I don't believe was great. And I don't think the consultation was actually very productive. And I would like to commend the Mallard Pass Action Group for the work that they did in actually raising the awareness with local residents across the entire area. And I have received I won't give an exact figure, but I have also received hundreds of emails from local residents that live in Keswick Ward and around the area objecting to this. And it is very, very minority for those people that are actually supporting this. I even had a conversation earlier this week by a resident in Gretford commenting about if this scheme was to go ahead, he's already been told that should he wish to put solar panels on his rooftop, the grid would be at capacity loading should this application go forward. So this is actually preventing local residents from doing their own energy efficiency savings on their own buildings. I think some of the other areas that will obviously you'll hear from later is just to do with the sheer size and scale of this development. We have other applications that will be coming forward in this district that are suitable for that location as to where they are. They will not be as visible as this. You've got a whole load of other issues such as loss of habitat, loss of amenity, the visual impact, the traffic impact alone, the safety concerns, sourcing concerns of those panels from the certain region in China, the loss of productive land and the increased flood risk. And these are just a few of the areas where there is still a lack of clarity on some of these areas. Thank you.
Thank you, councillor Cook. The next speaker is. Are you happy to answer a question?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So yourself, in your view, who will benefit from this the most? Will the energy provider be the energy provider? Will it mean cheaper fuel bills for people? Who's the greater beneficiary from this application?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you look at the business, unfortunately, we don't know the actual business plan in terms of the profit that will be made, but it will be the developers. The developers will be taking a significant profit out of this. And yes, we know we've got issues with capacity across the whole of the UK, but this will not cheapen our electricity bills.
Thank you, councillor Cook. I don't think that's a question that a layman would be able to answer, but thank you anyway. The next speaker is from the Parish Council, councillor Jason Halsey from Gretford, please.
No, not necessary.
Thank you, Mr Halsey.
Thank you,
Got
Mr.
3
Chairman.
minutes, please.
Gretford Parish Council would like to point out, would like to raise the potential issues of flooding and traffic that we believe have not been adequately addressed in the peer report or the independent report into the peer report. Gretford is prone to flooding during periods of high rainfall. The West Glen River overtops its banks just upstream of the village and continues with runoff from farmland to the north of the village to flood homes and gardens. It is our belief that hundreds of hectares of solar panels in the fields that drain into the West Glen immediately upstream of Gretford will increase the speed and intensity of flooding. There will be little warning of these events are about to happen. The area of soil able to receive the incoming rainfall will be roughly halved as the panels will act as a roof over half of the total topsoil area. Rain will run off the panels along the bottom edges, vastly increasing the quantity of water received by the soil immediately below the edges of the panels. 4.2% of the covered soil area will receive all the rainfall onto these panels, that falls onto these panels. This will quickly saturate the area of soil under the bottom edge of the panels. The water will start to flow over land into drains and ditches far more quickly than is currently happening. We also believe the situation will further be exacerbated by soil compaction caused during the construction of the site. Compaction will greatly diminish the soil's ability to soak up water falling onto the land. In the peer report, it claims that compaction will not be caused. However, when questioned about this during the Gretford consultation, Mallard Pass could not say how this would be achieved. Furthermore, in their report, it states that the soil in this area is typically at field capacity, which is full of water, for over 110 days of the year, usually in the winter. That's 220 days during construction, which will take 2 years. Driving heavy construction equipment onto the wet soil will significantly increase this compaction. Mallard Pass were quite clear when questioned at the Gretford consultation event that construction would take over 2 years and would not stop in the winter. Therefore, compaction would be caused. We believe that compaction under the panels will increase the flood risk immediately downstream of the site, and this has not been taken into consideration in the peer report or the independent review. Gretford is also very concerned about the accumulation effect of construction traffic. There are already a number of 106 routing agreements in place for quarry traffic, which are being ignored and ignored and not being policed correctly by the planning authority. And Gretford would like to see, if possible, these 106s, if the construction goes ahead, these 106 routing agreements enforced or a weight limit put onto the village of Gretford.
3 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Halsey. The next speaker is Tony Orvis of the.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question?
Councillor.
Question, gentleman? Yeah, thank you. Through yourself, Mr. Chairman. I've made a note, risk of flooding, because I didn't quite understand how it would impact upon your community. So thank you very much indeed for highlighting that issue. I believe you said that you'd raised this issue and it hadn't been addressed. How can this be addressed, if it can be addressed? Could you just line us on?
Well, obviously it can be addressed by not having so many solar panels in such a concentrated area, either side of the River Glen, which is actually, and they're on the banks of the where the water naturally flows into the river. So it's just exacerbating that flow. But then also you would then, if it did go ahead, you would look to the Environment Agency to then do some kind of mitigation on the river to build up banks, perhaps to increase cuts, to be dredging the river as well, just to remove that extra volume of water that we believe will exist because of the solar panels.
Thank you, Mr. Halsey. The next speaker, Tony Orvis of the representatives from Mallard Pass Action Group, please. Got 3 minutes, Mr. Orvis. Thank you.
Thank you. The scale of the scheme is unprecedented, far larger than any solar farm operating in the UK. And scaling up to the level proposed could have unknown consequences. There is no evidence that sequential testing was carried out properly, with other technologies being considered and alternative locations being fully explored. Ease and cost of connecting to the grid was the first consideration. The initial assumption was that the land would be largely agricultural land classification 3B. Soil testing proved that to be incorrect, with 53% of the solar panel site being grade 2 and 3A, best and most versatile land. Even this could be understated according to the report you commissioned. Government guidance is that such land should be reserved for food production. The land is undulating, not as flat as is normally the case with solar farms. This will make screening of the site impossible, especially as the considerable amount of new planting required will take 15 years to become fully effective. The applicants themselves state that the development could impact on the visual resource experienced, and views may change from open outlook across agricultural fields to views of Mallard Pass Solar Farm. Solar is the least efficient of the renewables in the UK, delivering only 11% of stated capacity. It is not as carbon friendly as generally considered, as is evidenced by a UN report issued earlier this year. The development will not be carbon neutral until 2039. The viable life of solar panels is 25 to 30 years, so the panels will need replacing or the life of the plant curtailed to the length of the initial lease, reducing current claims on output and carbon reduction. As far as diversification is concerned, the landowners who currently farm the land will be relinquishing all input and control for 40 years. In effect, this is more akin to a disposal than rural diversification. Finally, the prospect of an industrial landscape, with all that will mean for rural living and the local ecology, is causing deep anxiety and stress within the community. This is evidenced by over 700 people signing up to our newsletter, 200 people coming to Action Group meetings, and over 400 sending the Action Group copies of their consultation responses. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Orvis. Yep.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for your presentation. You mentioned that renewables and solar in particular are not carbon friendly, I think you said. But would you not accept that solar and renewables in particular and solar are at least a whole lot more carbon friendly than the current suppliers, which is oil and gas?
Yes. No, I accept they're not. I accept that they are. The answer to your question is yes, I would accept.
Thank you, Mr. Orvis. Next speaker is David Allison, please. Sorry, that's Alliston, sorry.
Sorry, you won't be the first person that's made that mistake, I can assure you.
Thank you. You've got 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate the opportunity of being able to share my opposition to the Mallard Pass Solar Farm, but of course, 3 minutes restricts me just to 2 areas. So I'm going to focus on the impact to the local area and thereafter the impact on local food production. After growing up in London, I chose to make Stamford, the Stamford area my home because of the career opportunities and the innumerable benefits the environment would have on my physical and mental health. 25 years later, I can reflect on it being the right decision. That benefits not only me, but also my wife, Claire, our 12-year-old son, Ben, and my 10-year-old daughter, Sophie. As individuals and as a family, we're active, and I'm proud to say that Ben and Sophie are already accomplished triathletes. The majority of our walking, running, cycling happens on the local roads, footpaths, and bridle paths. For the entirety of the 2-year construction phase, hundreds of daily HGV movements and traffic associated with 400 site workers will make the area far too dangerous, especially with young children. So, unbelievably, that activity will have to stop. Nearly 500,000 3.3 metre high panels, miles of security fencing, CCTV cameras, security lighting, and inverters will industrialise our countryside immediately. The rolling local topography is exposed in many parts, so screening will simply not protect the view from distance or when on the bridle paths. We take great interest in the wild deer, muntjac, brown hares, owls, hawks, and red kites. The steel, concrete, lighting, and security fences will obviously drive them away, which is an appalling message for our children and grandchildren. The impact on local food production. We have a major shortage of affordable food in the UK and beyond. The land that we would lose under the solar farm will typically produce 5,000 tonnes of commodities every year. My basic assessment is the milling wheat proportion of the 5,000 tonnes would be sufficient for 1.6 million loaves of bread each year, which we will now not be able to produce from wheats grown in our own country. For wider context, the UN forecasts that the global population will reach 10.32 billion in 2065, approximately 40 years' time, which is 2.44 billion more mouths to feed. And staggeringly, the world population increases by 277,000 people a day. We only produce about 60% of our own food as it is, and I challenge the arrogance and short-sightedness that believes that sacrificing productive land for 40 years, decreasing our food security and increasing our food miles for the sake of inefficient solar panels that will quickly be overtaken by more advanced technology is the right thing to do.
30 seconds.
This huge solar farm is expected to produce just 11% of the 350 megawatts on average. So by any measure, the benefit to the economy is meagre. Yet the damage caused to our local communities and beyond by irreversibly transforming our beautiful arable countryside into sterile, uniform and manufactured no man's land would be a decision future generations reflect on with incredulity. It is crucial we see beyond the greenwashing and the opportunity for developers to earn a quick buck by opposing this development and vehemently protecting the local environment we all call home. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Alliston. I think that's all the speakers. So now we'll move on to questions to the officer. Yes, Phil.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Clearly, we've got an application here for that we're not going to determine. It's going to be the government are going to determine it. We know that, but it is an application for clean, secure, local production of energy, not controlled by Russia or the oil and gas giants who are polluting the planet and have caused over 40 years the climate change emergency that we're in now. I would like to reserve my right to speak in debate, but I have got a number of questions that I'd like to sort of pose, and I'm happy just to rush through them so that Phil, the officer, can answer or in respond in his own way. I think it can kind of, for me, it's all summed up on page 48 of the report, paragraph 516, that quotes the overarching national policy statement for energy. And it says, and the two sentences are, it says that we should consider the potential effects, including benefits, of a proposal for a project. And then it talks about, we find it helpful if the applicant sets out information on the likely significant social and economic effects of the development and shows how any likely significant negative effects would be avoided or mitigated. I understand that, you know, there's a lot of mitigations have already happened, and I'm sure that there are more that, you know, in light of the objections raised today, more that can and should be implemented. But I think my first sort of question would be, really, how many homes or businesses, and I understand the objectors saying they don't believe that this will provide 92,000, you know, electricity or energy for up to 92,000 homes, but that's what we're being told at the moment. But in comparison to that, how many homes or businesses will be directly affected by the application, i.e. likely to suffer significant harm to their existing amenity? That would be my first question. I'll rush through the others if you're happy with that. Okay.
Excuse me, Phil, do you want to answer that one, Phil, or would you rather them all come together? All together?
I thought you might say that, Phil. Okay, I'll try and tick them off as I go. Can you confirm that the site, as I understand it, would not be a total loss to agriculture for the 40 years of the application, but that I understand that, you know, in most solar farms the land is used at the same time as having solar panels on it is used mainly for sheep grazing. I accept that's not, you know, perhaps, you know, the top food production that colleagues have said. I wondered if there is any information that we've got that sort of substantiates the claim in the application that it would provide energy for the 92,000 homes, which, as I think Councillor Baxter said, is actually more homes than are in the whole of South Kesteven and the whole of Rutland County combined. And I think that is fundamental to the whole thing. If there isn't a significant benefit, then I accept why are we doing it, but I would like to hear more about that. I've done that one. This business about, I noticed that the number one objection on the list of objections in the paperwork and referred to by a number of the objector speakers is the detrimental impact on biodiversity. But can you confirm that the application does present an opportunity to improve biodiversity, green corridors, re-establish hedgerows and other mitigating measures, please? And that reminds me of, you know, if I might say now, in the 1970s, I recall, and many of us I'm sure will also recall, that there was an application for to create the biggest man-made lake in Britain because there was a shortage of water at the time, as there is now in other parts of the country, but we haven't had a hosepipe ban, have we? And it was Rutland Water, of course. And there were all very, very similar objections to this from the farmers and local residents, of course, some of who lost their houses, of course. However, what I just sort of, you know, ask colleagues who today would think that Rutland Water was a bad decision 50 years later. It was a good decision. And who would argue against it? Not only have we secured water, you know, probably not in this area, just in this area, but the whole of a big area. But there's also a magnificent sort of tourism thing. I'll sum up. Okay, I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman, but say thank you. May I finally ask one other of Phil, and that is, and it's as a couple of colleagues did raise, we are sort of the recommendation is, and I understand the recommendation is that is to formally object. It's to put a holding objection in. Would it be possible to put in a holding welcoming the application subject to the answers to the following questions that you have? And I think that's my initial questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Councillor Dilks. I'll do my best with the questions. I think the question about who's directly impacted is it's difficult to quantify to some extent. what a direct impact is can be subjective. What I would say is socioeconomic is within scope, and there's a chapter in that, and that will be carried through to the environmental statement. Likewise, the amenity impacts through the landscape and visual impacts is within scope and assessed, or will be assessed within that environmental statement. Probably the best way of quantifying numbers at this stage would be to highlight some of the numbers that have been quoted, I think, and you know, several members have mentioned hundreds of objections, and that tallies with the number that have come to us. So if someone stays silent, does it mean they're not directly impacted? It's difficult to say, but I think that's probably, if you wanted to quantify the volume of objection, that's one way of looking at who's directly impacted. The application does seek, or it stated it would seek a 40-year permission. These schemes can be used for alternative agricultural uses such as grazing within that 40-year lifespan. It does typically rule out food production, which, you know, a lot of the land is currently in that sort of arable land use. The questions around quantifying the outputs, again, the climate change is within scope, and there's a chapter in that in the report. The expert review of it at the moment is high level, and it just states that the approach to climate change impacts is in accordance with best practice. So I think, you know, at the moment we haven't got any further scrutiny of the information that's put forward, but all I can say is that it is a topic within the environmental statement, and will be a topic, and that'll be the source of that information. Biodiversity, yes, typically solar farms do result in a net gain over a period of time, and that's the case here. There are elements to the scheme which are not good for ecology and biodiversity, particularly some of the more permanent or significant bits of built infrastructure, such as the substation. But typically, if you take land out of what's currently an arable land use, and there's opportunities for different grass seed mixes and grazing and hedges to, you know, further planting, mitigation, things like that, that overall picture of the biodiversity assessment of the scheme, they typically do result in a biodiversity net gain, and that's been accepted on a number of schemes, and that's what's put forward in this case. I think that lastly, the terminology around the holding objection, just to confirm what we're asking there, appreciate it does include the language objection. What we're really saying is that based on the information in front of us at the moment, we don't consider it to be sufficiently robust to make those judgments further down the line. It's not a request that the overall merits of the scheme are, the council would object to the overall merits of the scheme. It's just that based on the information and the advice we've got at the moment, it's not considered that the decision maker or when we have to produce that local impact report, we would be comfortable in making a robust assessment. And from hearing the debate or the comments and speeches so far, I'm even more, clear that there are two sides to the argument. There is support for the scheme, and there are sort of benefits that have been outlined, but clearly there's a lot of concern, and the impacts have been highlighted by a number of members and a number of speakers. What we're saying as officers is that when it does come to making that judgment call on that balance, which will clearly be a balance, it's really, really important that the information and the studies that underpin those assessments are robust. And until such time as our experts are telling us that we're comfortable that information is robust, I think it's right to refer to that as a holding objection.
Emma, yeah, Emma wants to make a point.
Thank you. And I think that was a very comprehensive reply. Thanks, Phil. The only thing I just wanted to add is just to reassure members that no matter what we say today, because this is about making sure that the application that goes in front of the planning inspector is robust and covers all of the issues and has all of the right technical supporting documents. We're not bound to a particular position when it comes back to us to say, South Kesteven, what do you think of the proposal? So I suppose in one sense, a holding rejection today doesn't mean we have to object in the future, and it doesn't mean we can't support it in the future should we wish to. But once we have that detail and we're able to, as Phil said, make that balanced judgment and have the final details of the proposal in front of us. Thank you.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, thank you for that, Emma. What you're saying is it will come back to either the planning committee or the full council, is that right?
So the application has not yet been formally submitted to the inspector for it to be considered as a DCO, a development consent order. When it does, there are various other pieces of work that need to be done, but when it does, ultimately we will be formally consulted on the final proposals. That is the point at which we can say, on balance, we object, or on balance, we support it, or caveated in principle, but and I believe Councillor Robbins, Nick Robbins, had said at full council that his intention was that response would go before full council. Thank you.
Councillor Selby, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, whilst I don't think that these solar panels will become a tourist attraction, and whilst, sorry, Phil, and whilst I'm disappointed that there's not a representative from the applicant here today to give us any technical advice and information that would be helpful to us, I'm disappointed whilst saying that they're not here today. I would like to ask this question. I said, obviously, Phil's done a lot of research on this, so I hope you can answer this. Well, Phil, what's standing out to me is how many more of these power stations of the equivalent size are around the UK, and do any of them have plans for equivalent solar farms? Because it appears to me that this appears to be the only one of its size from what I've been hearing. So I asked the question, why is this the only one? Why are there not other power stations and these solar panel farms appearing in other locations around the UK? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Selby. So just to be clear, the comments about the scale of this proposal being unparalleled, it really refers in terms of sites that are operational and on the ground. If you visit the website for nationally significant infrastructure projects, put that into Google, it's the first one that comes up. And there's a search box, and if you put in solar farm, it'll list out all the proposals that are currently lodged with, for consideration. And some of those are further along than this. Some of them, the development consent order application's already been submitted. Some of them are still at this pre-application stage. And you'll see on there that there are a number of these much larger scale solar farms. And I think, as I said in the presentation, that's my understanding is that's off the back of that draft national policy statement, which now specifically includes these utility scale solar farms. And you'll see that there are a number. We've got another scheme which the scoping opinion's been submitted and published to the north of Folkingham on the old RAF Folkingham site. There's a scheme at Heckington Fen where I believe there's previously been consented wind farms. That's in North Kesteven. And there are schemes around the Nottinghamshire border, and I believe some of those are around former sort of power station sites. But the answer is there are a number of these around, not just in Lincolnshire and the adjoining areas. There are a number of emerging schemes across the country. They all, I've not looked at everyone in detail, and they all come with pros and cons. The scheme at Folkingham, for example, is partly on a former airfield, but there's a much longer grid connection there that it's proposed to connect to a grid connection point up at Bicker Fen, which is 7-8 miles away, something like that. So that's just one example of a different current land use, and it's a different sort of if you looked at the shape of the proposal, but there is a completely different impact in terms of grid connection. So yeah, but it's interesting, and as I say, if you visited that website, you'll see a number of these schemes are emerging and will likely be considered at the same time, and it's one of the challenges county council colleagues have got, because there's several of them within Lincolnshire.
I think, Emma, you just do you want to give the figures, please, just to answer the question?
So quick search, and admittedly, at least one that I happen to know is in, was not described as a solar farm. So there could be others, but I found 10. 2 have been consented, and the others at various points in terms of their process. Some have been submitted formally, and others are expected in the next sort of 9 months or so. That includes Mellor Pass.
Just for clarification, that's the NSIP ones and not the smaller ones.
Yes, that's correct, Chairman. Just the NSIP one. So their schemes, they're over 50 megawatts. Smaller schemes obviously come straight to the local planning authority.
Sorry, Emma, just if you do want to go and do that research, some of them are described as energy parks. So Mallard Pass Solar Farm, Temple Oaks Energy Park, I think is the name of the Folkingham one, off the top of my head. So if you put in either energy park or solar farm, you'll get a feel for the schemes that are currently being considered.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to say thank you very much. Excellent reply. I really appreciate that. Is there any chance you could send me some of the links? I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Harris, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have got some concerns with regards to this development. I'm more concerned about the environmental impact assessments, because I feel currently what is in here in front of us, there's no detailed impact on it, especially on biodiversity, its effects on the wildlife, the wild birds of prey. Second thing that I felt greatly that will impede this wildlife is the security fencing that's going to be around the solar panels around to protect them. I would like to know, if possible, if Phil know about it, where the actual solar panel itself are and the mounting frames coming from. Are they being imported? And what is the actual carbon footprint? So I just wonder if that's what the gentleman from Grateford was mentioning about the carbon footprint will not be that much of a difference, even though I fully support about renewable energies. And my second question is why there has not been consideration to have a mix of renewable energy, i.e. solar and wind power as well within the site, because that will cut down quite a lot of the footprints of the current proposal.
So I think I sort of picked up a couple of questions there. In terms of ecology and biodiversity, it's a similar point to the one I made earlier about deferring to other experts. If you visit the Mallard Pass website, there's all the documents listed on there. The preliminary environmental information report is over 500 pages. It's a really lengthy technical document, and within that there is a whole chapter around ecology and biodiversity, which is well within scope. What the approach we've taken on that subject matter is to defer comments to Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, who've been actively engaged in the consultation to date, and in Rutland, they've referred to or deferred to the experts they've got at their own county council, or Leicestershire County Council, I believe they've used. But that particular subject matter is covered within the report. It's just that we haven't actively engaged on that topic at this stage because we've deferred to those other expert local groups for comments. The question about the solar panels and where do they come from? I'm aware that's been a sort of a point of concern that's been raised, and my understanding is it's not a relevant planning consideration. There's no way, as far as I'm aware, in planning terms of controlling supply chain matters. If you think about, typically, if we grant planning permission for a housing estate, we can control the look and appearance of materials, but we can't say whether those bricks are imported from the continent or made locally or elsewhere. So understand, some of the issues around supply chain, and my sort of answer or approach would be that that's covered by other relevant legislation as opposed to being a planning matter. Just remind me, there was a third question. I didn't, or has that answered the questions?
Colin Irish, please.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. About the efficiency of the solar panel. There are solar panels that are produced in UK that's far more efficient, per panel than it is that those coming from overseas. From the Far East, but the carbon footprint load from there for it to come down, it will be significantly more, because that has to be flown in or come by boat, whichever way. So I think it should be a consideration for us, because we need to give the jobs to our people here. We are already supposed to be in a recession. I don't know, we don't take that into consideration.
I take your point, but I think Phil's already answered that one. I agree, it's a concern, but it's not something for the planning committee, unfortunately. I mean, maybe it's something that certainly can come up when it comes back to full council before we send our final reply. Next speaker, questions. Councillor Stevens, please.
It's really the same question, but the other end. There is concern, I think, about the sustainability of solar panels themselves and what happens to them, after 40 years. Where do they go? Some of them actually, it's not, you can't do anything with them. It's a real problem. The problem with this site is that everything is in magnitude, isn't it? Because it's such a large area. So if you're going to have defunct solar panels that are going to stack up, that it may not be a planning consideration, but if we stick them all in landfill, that might be. So I'm just wondering what consideration there's being given to the kind of solar panel, because I think that it might be new technology that will be better than old technology in terms of what's put there. I hope we don't get saddled if this does happen, with a load of defunct cheap technology that's being imported from God knows where, that may well produce a planning issue in future years. So I just wonder what your response to that would be.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Stevens. It's a good question, and I think it's one that's quite difficult to rationalise in some ways, in that the application as stated, would be seeking a 40-year consent, and that's in line with the two recent schemes we've consented in South Kesteven. Typically what we've done with local schemes is had conditions which does allow for some replacement of panels along the way, and then there's typically a condition that covers the decommissioning strategy at the end of the 40-year lifespan, and you know, that can cover a number of impacts that would be associated with the decommissioning. But equally, I do accept it's a difficult point to get to and understand. Is 40 years, you know, who knows? And I guess to some extent it would depend on what alternative energy sources were around at that time. We have had solar farms in South Kesteven that were granted, some of the early ones that were granted, you know, some years ago now, where they've sought to, you know, early days they were granted 15, 20-year consents, and, you know, seeking to sort of lengthen the time of those. As I say, it's really difficult to say what would happen in 40 years' time. And as for the sort of the waste management impacts associated with it, I think that's quite a difficult matter to control through planning. I'll be honest, I don't know enough about the different types of panels that would be currently available, and, you know, if they can be disposed of in more environmentally friendly ways. But in terms of the impacts associated with that decommissioning, typically it's covered by a condition which requires a strategy for that point in time, if indeed it does get commissioned.
Emma, if you.
Thank you. I'm hearing some really, really good questions, actually, and I think Phil's doing an amazing job of trying to answer them, given he's not the applicant and doesn't have all of the background knowledge. What I'm thinking is some of the questions, they're very pertinent. They're not necessarily as relevant to the task today. Maybe we speak to the developer about holding a briefing session where we can do some Q's and A's, and then you can ask all of those questions outside of this process, obviously way in advance of the next sets of formal stages, and then that hopefully will give you more of the background information and answer some of these questions that may or may not become relevant to the next stage, because I think some probably do have relevance later on, but are perhaps less so to today's sort of proceedings. So if that would be, and I can see a few nods, if that would be helpful, we'll get that set up and actioned for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Councillor Sarah Trotter, please.
This might be an easy one for you, Phil. Thank you very much, giving us a comprehensive reply. And you did mention the Falkingham site, which I've been involved with, not going off on a tangent, but it's very well supported, probably because of where it is and the scale. And I think this is what's in question. It's the huge scale of 1,400 football pitches on a agricultural land. What I need to ask you is, and I'm sorry if you've already covered it or etc., is how much weight do all the other applications for solar farms, probably in really good places like on an old airfield, does that have any bearing at all upon this site? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a really good question, and it is something we've considered as officers and talked about. And I can't give a categorical answer, but I can sort of give my best opinion on it. And I suspect what you've got is you've got a number of these schemes coming forward and being developed at the same time. And clearly there are benefits and disbenefits from each scheme. As I said, the Falkingham scheme has that longer grid connection, which is a sort of a more of a disbenefit than some of the brownfield land that's associated with it. And I think ultimately when the decisions are made on these, they're going to be weighted decisions, as a lot of decisions are, weighing up benefits versus disbenefits. And I suspect that if there are other schemes which are in that balance preferential, it might affect the way that the decision makers will ultimately make the decisions. You know, in terms of how much weight to apply to particular sort of benefits or disbenefits of any scheme. But it's a you know, an interesting sort of time really, because a number of these schemes are going to come forward at the same time. And as I said, you know, the county council colleagues are directly involved in a number of these. And just from a sort of practicality point of view, the examinations, you know, you've got that resourcing challenge of holding them alongside each other. So I think they're the sort of relevant questions we're going to continue to ask as officers is, you know, ultimately when assuming these all do come forward, how will those examinations take place? Will it be you know, things be considered alongside each other, or how will it be timetabled? But at the moment, as I said, I don't have a definitive answer for that. And that, you know, the way I've answered is my best available information at the moment.
Thank you, Phil. And just finishing, you know, we're all for renewable energy. We just want to get it right. And I appreciate that SKDC, we've got a lot of questions that need answering. And it's so important because obviously there's a lot of upset in local residents and they're ultimately the ones that are directly affected. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Councillor Penny Mills.
I think a lot of questions have already been put to Phil. I might be verging into debate, possibly. Does the sheer scale of this application have any bearing in our responses when we're looking at the technical information that we're looking at the moment? Obviously, I understand that it's early days. We're looking at this technical information that's been put forward. We're not happy that we're short of information and what have you, and that's why we're doing this holding objection. Where in that does the sheer scale of this site come? Because I think we said it's one of the very biggest. I know all NSIPs are over 50 megawatts, but that's a small scale site compared to this. And I don't think I've seen many that are even verging onto a scale of this nature in what is actually a very sensitive landscape and a sensitive area of villages and towns and recreational use and agriculture. So how does that impact on the response that we're about to make at the moment?
I think scale is definitely relevant, but it depends which side of the debate you're on. And if you're looking at the benefits of solar farm and renewable schemes and you accept the benefits, if you scale them up, the benefits become greater. But on the other side of the argument, the disbenefits, the landscape and visual harm that might occur, the loss of agricultural land that might occur also gets greater. The difficulty is it isn't like a mathematical equation. We haven't got any policy that says X amount of best and most valuable land equates to X amount of energy generation. It will ultimately come down to a judgment. At this stage, all we can reasonably do is ask that the information available when the application does come forward is suitably robust to inform those judgments to be made accurately and robustly. Just to remind members, this is still pre-application, so we're commenting on the information available at the moment, but this isn't the final proposal, and we don't know what that final proposal will be until the application, if indeed the application is made, will be. So I think for that reason, it is difficult to comment at this moment on the scale of the proposal, because it's not known. It's not sort of it's not the finished proposal, but it is relevant to comment on the information that will inform the impacts associated with the scale.
And where in this process that we're in at the moment, does the looking at alternative land, I understand it's around Mallard's Pass simply because there's a grid connection there with capacity and they find some land and try and make it fit. Where in the scheme of things do they look at alternative land or alternative places that wouldn't be as sensitive, would be more suitable?
Yep, so alternatives again is within scope in the environmental statement, and just refer members to it's our page 70 of the report. There are some concerns there raised about or some requests for further information in terms of site selection and alternatives. So that will be one of the points that's fed back to the applicants. Yeah, and that really would be around, you know, alternative sites and alternative pieces of land. How was this site arrived at, and how were those alternatives ruled out, and why?
So when we look, for example, at the smaller ones, which are up to 50 megawatts, and we look at cumulative, and we say, well, can you see another site from here, which I believe is about the assessment of cumulative. This is worth, what, 7 of those sites in terms of the size of it. How do we then compare that in cumulative amount of visual impact on the area when we're also concerned with a much smaller one and the cumulative visual impact?
Yeah, I mean, the cumulative impacts would be this scheme in relation to other schemes, and that can cover a number of those topics, both the visual impacts, but it can also look at things like the traffic impacts of if you've got 2 large scale proposals alongside each other, you know, how do they sort of interplay with each other? The Falkingham one's a good example. There's at least 2 of these are proposed to go to the same grid connection point, and so there you've clearly got an impact in terms of, or cumulative impact in terms of traffic and highways impacts. Yeah, I think, you know, it's not necessarily a cumulative impact, but just the scale of the landscape and visual impacts are obviously quantified because it's a much bigger proposal. There's a number of individual viewpoints that have been looked at, and it's that sort of baseline and scope of the study work which will ultimately sort of inform, you know, the findings of that study area.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, thank you, Phil. Councillor Richard Cleaver, please, Richard.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to raise a number of fairly technical points, Phil, and I think possibly Emma as well. Sort of working top down. So the EN3 draft is, of course, a draft. And one would expect that we are going to have a national policy which will be fairly specific about solar developments at some point in the future, which begs the question, do we have to then ensure that we future-proof any responses we make to try and cover off any changes that might be made above our heads with the new policy adopted by central government? And in fact, what happens if such a new policy comes in the middle of the examination after the application has been made, just so we know where we stand with that. And again, slightly related to that, we obviously have our policy in place as part of the local plan. I think it's Appendix 3, is it, on renewables? Presumably, if anything we put in to the examination contradicts that won't count against us. Presumably we're not bound by that. We can't be told, no, we can't take account of what you've said because you're contradicting yourself, you're contradicting your own policy. Then come in terms of community concerns regarding flooding, which I think are very real and understandable concerns, because there obviously is a problem in some of the villages in SK. Are you, first of all, from what you've seen in the reports, satisfied that nothing will be any worse? If not, should we again be looking for further work to be done, again, in line with the recommendations? Is it something we should be asking to have further research done on? And is there also then an opportunity for us within this scheme, if it goes ahead, to actually make the situation better, so to actually lower the flood risk from what it is at the moment? Because then clearly there would be a benefit for those communities from the Mallard Pass scheme. Again, relating to the recommendations, we've spoken about this earlier. I am concerned, given that we are measuring the grades of agricultural land against national policy norms, the table of the number of hectares of land in each grade and subgrades 3A and 3B is not split down between those areas where there will be solar panels and those areas which will be mitigation, which of course is 50-50 of the site. And it's also then not clear what proportion of the mitigation land could still remain in agricultural production. So on the information we have, it clearly isn't quite clear, one, how much of each grade will be taken out of agricultural production across the mitigation land and the panel covered land, if that's the right term. And then finally, no one's mentioned it yet, Section 106. Obviously, there are concerns within the community about the effects that this proposal would have on those communities if it goes ahead. And of course, Section 106 is designed to mitigate the effects of developments on communities. So my question is, have officers had any thoughts yet about the sort of mitigations that could be obtained through Section 106? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Councillor Cleaver. I'm just going to make a general comment or suggestion to begin with. What the officer report is proposing is that those technical reports that we've commissioned are endorsed by the planning committee today. The recommendation include or allows for the final response to be delegated to Assistant Director of Planning in consultation with portfolio holder, I believe, or Chairman of the Planning Committee. We've envisaged the response will be a letter back to the applicants, and those reports included in their entirety. The consultation, for the formal consultation, did end on the 4th of August. So we're a week behind that at the moment. As with most or all planning applications, the dialogue doesn't stop, and there is a ability to continue sort of making questions up to the point of submission or with this case. But what I was going to suggest, Emma, was that I think we have a duty to provide our written response quickly following this meeting, or as quickly as possible. But I think perhaps if we allowed for maybe a date early next week, we could pick up relevant questions members might have, particularly around the impacts of the proposal. And I think I'm sort of jumping to your last question, or second from last question, which was really around quantifying what the different amounts of agricultural land that would be impacted by the proposal were. So I think you were asking, what the various grades are, what the quantities are, how much would be used for mitigation, how much would be used for solar panels. And if that isn't embedded within the very long and technical statement, it certainly is a relevant question. And I think that is a question that we could put back to the applicants or seek further clarity on that. Jumping back to your, sorry, Emma, did you want to comment on whether that's a reasonable approach to picking up on any of those sort of unanswered questions at this stage.
I think so. We just have to be mindful of the fact that we do have to get a response in. It doesn't need to be the only response. We are meeting with the applicants on a regular basis. So we do have plenty of opportunities to feedback other comments that are perhaps more relevant to the wider scheme rather than sort of today's exercise and do it that way. So
would it be relevant, the briefing you spoke about, would that be the relevant opportunity to do that?
I think it would, but certainly making it clear that we do need to understand the quantum of agricultural land that would be given up and at what grade, I think is exceedingly relevant to today's point, because actually one of the issues that we've identified is around the amount of soil testing, so that we can understand and whether the baseline studies and whether the survey methodology is correct. And of course, we don't think it is. So if it isn't, how can we possibly know the quantum of grade 2, grade 3, whatever it is, agricultural land that would be given up? And that's really, really important, because the planning inspector and Secretary of State ultimately will need to be able to say there is a loss of X amount of agricultural land at this grade. That is a harm and an impact to be balanced against the benefits of the scheme. So he needs to be, or she needs to be, fully appraised of all those facts. It's really important that the applicants make that clear in their final proposals. Thank you.
Yeah, and then just jumping back to the other questions, the changing and evolving policy context is it's relevant really for the decision maker, which is the Secretary of State and the examination body. Whilst I don't think it's it's likely that policy context might evolve, particularly on a national level. I think the impacts will and the relevant considerations will remain the same, regardless of what that policy says. We'll be talking about benefits, landscape visual impacts, ecology, biodiversity. I think that will remain the same. The policy as to how those are weighted and balanced might change, but that's really a matter for the decision maker. And I think that really backs up the approach that we're suggesting today, which is to seek further information around the reports and the evidence base in order that those individual impacts and considerations can be properly assessed. As I say, I think further down the line, there are many more opportunities that we get involved, both informally. Emma spoke about potential for a briefing. We've got the regular dialogue we have with the applicants at an officer level. But as this enters into the application stage, there are then other statutory requirements commenting on the consultation that's been undertaken and producing that local impact report. So certainly there will be further down the line opportunities to really sort of quantify and reach further conclusions around the overall impacts of the proposal. Flood risk, heard some interesting things today in relation to flood risk and clearly some local concerns there. I think, as we would do if this was our own application and our own, we were the determining authority, we would have to defer to the experts on that. And I heard both the Environment Agency mentioned, Lincolnshire County Council's lead local flood authority, and any various internal drainage boards would all be relevant and expert consultees in informing judgments. They have all been consulted and will all be producing their own answers. So I don't see it's a matter that we need to directly engage in at this moment in time, other than to maybe make it clear in our response that that is the way we see things. We defer to those experts on those matters. Last point, and again, I think it is very relevant, and it's not something I know the answer to. Section 106, and also members may recall from the solar farms we've determined, the community benefit packages which happen in the background, which aren't, we're very clear they aren't material to the outcome of the application. It is unusual, but it's typically an agreement between the local community or the affected community and the proposer. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure how that happens on this national scale, because it's not something we've experienced before. But I think it would be a relevant question that we can ask of the applicants.
Emma just wants to come in, Phil, if that's okay.
I think perhaps what we can do is just take some legal advice as well as to how best the parish and town councils might be able to engage with the developer on that particular point. Section 106, of course, is meant to be used to mitigate the impacts of the development. So there is difference between betterment and mitigation, and we have to be very careful not to stray into the betterment through section 106. But as I say, there are other mechanisms, but we'll get some advice and see what support we can give to the local towns and parish councils.
Thank you. Are we okay to go on over the 3 hours? Like I say, we're nearly at 4 o'clock. Go over the 3 hours. Yeah. Okay. Everybody happy? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Councillor Robert Reid, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The Vice Chairman is sort of partly to it. I'm getting a little bit confused as to how far these questions are actually in debate. I take on board and thank most genuinely Emma's offer that further consultation on questions can take place down the line as well. So therefore, I'd like to register to speak in debate when you move to that.
Councillor Harris, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the third question that probably I missed. You just come to me, Mr. Phil. It was a very simple question. Was at any time during the considerations of this solar farm proposal, the consideration to put wind power energy considered to be as a mix?
My understanding is that the discussion of alternatives is around alternative sites for effectively the same, or proposal of the same nature. I'm not aware that there's any requirement on the applicants to effectively consider what would be an alternative proposal. You know, the use of wind turbines would likely be a lower amount of land use, but clearly would come with a whole, you know, set of different considerations and impacts. And not, as far as I'm concerned, that isn't a relevant consideration to the you know, to the discussion at the moment.
Councillor Selby, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, a couple of days ago, as a matter of courtesy to the people of Essendine and Ryle and the surrounding villages, I had a ride over to the area and to have a ride round and to get a feel of the place. I had a good ride around all the locations that's referred to on our maps, so you get a general feel of the environment. And the one thing that struck me, Mr. Chairman, was there's a lot of woodland. It's the wildlife that sort of came to the forefront of my thinking, and I would like, basically, my question is regarding the impact upon the wildlife. I would like us to have some more information on that, please, at some point, Mr. Chairman. I just think it's so important, because the only thing I can see so far, Mr. Chairman, is with the risk of flooding, we're going to have an increase in ducks, and I can't see any other benefits. So I would like some information on that, please, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Got anything, Phil, on that one, or?
I think just to say what I've already said, really, you know, that whole sort of topic area of wildlife ecology, biodiversity, it's within topic, and it's covered in the preliminary report and will be covered within the environmental statement. And we would, as a local authority, defer to the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust for their expert comments on that subject area.
Councillor Dilks, and then I think that's we've had 2 hours on questions and what have you, so I think then we'll probably have a 10-minute comfort break.
Can I just say, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, and I mean, I thank the objectors and those four and everybody. I know we haven't got to the debate yet, but we have had some very good questions raised, and I hope it will allow. I do share Councillor Selby's concern that, you know, the applicant's not here, but of course, hopefully they can see it online, what we've discussed. And I'm sure there'll be a paper going from the officers, you know, to the applicant to allow them to further mitigate, if I could put that, in response to questions that have been raised before they actually put their formal application in the autumn. I would hope that what we're doing is not going to delay the process, and frankly, I don't think it will. I actually did also register to speak in the debate, you know, when I put my questions. But before we get there, Mr. Chairman, I just wonder if I could seek clarification, and I think it's okay. But in the recommendation, paragraph 7.1, it talks about the committee endorses the following draft response. And delegates authority to the Assistant Director of Planning in consultation with the portfolio holder to issue the final response. I assume that is the final initial response, if I could put that, and that, as you said earlier, once we've heard, you know, it will, at a later stage, it will come back to either full, I think you said the portfolio holders indicate it will come back to full council. I just seek that. Personally, I've got to say I would be happier. I have great faith in you and the officers, but I would be happier if that was in consultation with the chairman of the planning committee and vice chairman of the planning committee and the portfolio holder, who of course is not here today for whatever reason, you know. I'd just say on Councillor Selby's point on wind turbines, you know, look, let's make no bones about it. The government have made it clear they're against land-based turbines, and you know, I think the Conservative Party are, you know, the ruling party are against land-based turbines, which is, you know, that's a policy statement. So I don't think we're going down there. This is something different, you know. It's solar, and I think both candidates to be new Prime Minister have actually said that they would be against land-based wind turbines. I think I heard that right, you know. But I would like to speak in debate when we get there. Thank you.
What's the question then, Phil? That what's the final
it was that
decision?
clarification I was seeking, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. I can answer that, give Phil's voice a slight rest. Obviously, it'd be for the committee in terms of the recommendation and whether that's run, the draft response is run past the chairman and vice chairman of this committee as well as the portfolio holder. But I'm personally comfortable with that if members wanted that to happen. The only thing is obviously we need to get that response fairly quickly out to the applicants, but I'm happy with that. And yes, it is just this response. It's not determining anything future. It is simply this response. I would add that normally these sorts of consultations are just sent out in my name, sometimes with discussion, but obviously something of this magnitude is worthy of input from the committee and the wider scale, because it is such a huge scheme.
Mr. Chairman, it was Councillor Bisnorting that actually raised the point about wind turbines and not myself. Yeah.
Councillor Stevens, last question.
Just going to say, it was not really a question, but bearing in mind what you've said about further information coming forward next week, perhaps, is it best to defer this until we've heard that?
In essence, we're past the date for the deadline date for responding, because we only get a certain amount of time in accordance with the legislation. So we've got to get a response really ASAP. Yes, there is more information, but this is really for the applicant to address moving forwards. They could choose to do another further planning sort of formal consultation, or they can seek to address it through the submission documents to the planning inspectorate. Either way, they have to have regard to it. So they are required to address the comments and concerns raised not only by this council, but by any other statutory consultee or interested party. So we may not get further formal consultation, but our comments will still be taken into account.
Okay, everybody, we'll take a 10-minute break. Yeah. Are you okay if we continue, Emma, or yeah? Yeah, thank you. Okay, we'll move on to the debate then. Councillor Reid, please.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman.
Could you switch the fan on, please, or move the fan? Cheers.
Thank you. I
Thanks,
wasn't too
Mark.
sure whether it was going to be me or Councillor Ditz was actually going to talk first in debate. Whilst I'm exceedingly concerned about the application, and indeed the many members of our district have demonstrated, primarily it's because of the size and the scale. Whilst I do support alternative energy sources, this is one that I cannot support as it harms the environment and the community, amongst other factors. Now, turning to legislation or related legislation, related policy of which I could quote paragraph 170, reference 01 and carry on. But the important bit within the related policy is that it states encouraging the effective use of land for focusing large-scale solar farms on previously developed and non-agricultural land. This application has come up in debate, and as all members are aware of course, lies on some grade 3 listed farmland, but also it does have a little bit of quality land involved as well. And it doesn't need me to remind everybody here that Lincolnshire is the garden basket of England and part of our very treasured food sources. Therefore, I've heard on several occasions this afternoon, particularly from our Assistant Director of Planning, the word robust. And I'd like to put forward a amendment to the recommendation. I appreciate I'm the first to speak, so it will probably not be seconded straight away, or might not be seconded at all. But what I'd like to actually see, rather than worrying too much about the addition of personnel, which has come up in debate, is I'd actually like to see that following on from the recommendations word final response, I'd like to see added robustly challenging this application on the grounds of detriment to our agricultural output, harms to our environment and community. If you'd like me to repeat that, that is robustly challenging this application on the grounds of detriment to our agricultural output, harms to our environment and community. And it looks as if I might have a seconder on that. I mean, of course, I'm interested in more debate, but I just think that from very much the poignant questions that have come up, which have been sort of debated as well, that is a reasonable recommendation to put forward to support the overall concerns, not just of the questions, but also of our community. Thank you.
Could you just repeat that just once more, please?
Yeah,
Just
of
'cause
course.
we're-
So where it says response, so we carry on robustly challenging this application on the grounds of detriment to our agricultural output, harms to our environment and community. It's all within the report, but I do think in the recommendation, we need to actually put a closing statement to it. Thank you.
Sorry, we're just still. Yep.
Can I clarify, are you suggesting that you would like the council to express concerns with the application, or is that more of an out and out objection to the proposal? Because if it's the latter, I don't think it's the appropriate time because we don't have the full details. But if it's just expressing that we remain concerned,
Then
if I
I
can
would be more
refer you then,
comfortable.
Emma, to the word I used, challenge, because that's what I meant by it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm clear on that now, councillor. And hopefully if the members of the committee are clear as well, then that's fine.
Can you put your mic on, please, Ian?
So isn't Appendix C covering this point? Because that's covering agricultural land, and this seems to be specific to the main recommendation, which, you know, appears irrelevant at this stage.
Councillor Dilks, you wanted to comment on the debate?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, has that been seconded? Are we now discussing the amendment? No, it hasn't. Okay. Thank you. I hope it isn't seconded, frankly, and I think that would, you know, would spoil the tenure of the meeting that we've had. There are clearly members who are in favour in principle of this and some who are against in principle. But I think we've had a good debate, and, you know, I accept that my, you know, possible suggestion of going the other way and saying that we're, you know, in favour of such applications may also not be the best way forward. So I don't support Councillor Reid's in that. I'm happy though to speak, if I may, in debate in general terms. This is urgent, Mr. Chairman. This is absolutely urgent. You know, we all know that. We've all been getting our bills. We've all been getting our energy bills. There has to be an alternative to actually destroying the earth, but we're doing it and we're paying bills for Putin's war in Ukraine. They've doubled, they've trebled, and now we're told they may quadruple before next year or on January the 1st next year. And people are, you know, we need to find the alternatives. And whilst I accept, you know, we can't wait for the technology for another 40 years, you know, we have to go with the technology we've got now. And I have no doubt that whilst we might question the amount of output and the number of homes that it would supply, it has to be better. And I also see the argument that the gentleman brought, I think it was the Gretford Parish Council, that said, you know, it's not going to be entirely green until 2037 or something. It may well be, but oil and gas are never going to be clean. They're filthy and they're destroying our planet right now. And, you know, anybody that can't see that and can't see the need to move ahead and actually find the alternatives, and this is a viable alternative. I accept the arguments that we've heard today, and the objections need to be looked at and fully mitigated as possible. But we, you know, in my view, I think this is something that we should be moving forward. If you look at, a colleague asked about why aren't we seeing more applications like this? I think we should see, I hope we do see more. There is room for more than one of these solar farms in Lincolnshire, and I would welcome them. If you look at leaseyourland.co.uk, they are crying out for landowners to put their land forward to be considered for solar farms. And, you know, the basic figures are on their site that if you've got 100 acres producing solar energy over 40 years, you'll receive 4.8 million. Now, 420 hectares equates to about 1,040 acres. So if you do those figures, the indication is that the landowner, this is worth £50 million over 40 years, well over £1 million. Now, I accept, you know, somebody's going to be making that money. Of course they are. But are they going to be pumping all this carbon into the air and the methane into the air from gas? No, they're not. It may not be absolutely clean from day one, but it will get there. It's just a no-brainer to me. Now, to achieve this solar harvest, and you know, it is a farm, solar farm, they're producing a product, and the product is energy. You don't have to, as I think Councillor Baxter said in his opening remarks, you don't have to be pouring increasingly expensive and polluting chemicals and fertilizers and nitrates into the environment. It's free of all that. That's the alternative. And you kind of have to ask, I ask, how much imported gas or oil would this actually save? And there has to be a saving. I don't know what that is, and maybe we should look more into it, but there is a huge benefit in saving. Eating, as colleagues have said, is important. Of course it is. Food production is important, but so is heating. And we get into the stage where no one, or the poorest in our society, cannot afford these bills that we're getting now. So we have to look, and this is a fraction of agricultural land to provide, to serve 92,000 homes, we are told. Yes, we need to look more at whether or not that is achievable. But if it's true, that is a no-brainer in my estimation. I've said that. So I understand the objections, and I think we have had a good debate. I know it's been mostly questions, but there's been some good questions. There's been some pretty obscure questions, but I do welcome the fact that we can, I think we can now get those questions answered by the applicant before the application comes in. Overall, I think it is a cheap technology. It's much cheaper than what we are producing now to the consumer. And we can't wait for the years, decades for the technology to improve until we get it perfect. I'm waiting for the solar TV to come out until I buy a new TV, but it ain't going to happen tomorrow. So on the I'm happy. I was tempted to put an amendment in to say, well, certainly to ask that in the covering letter that we have some words that indicate that we are not, that this council is not against renewable energy in principle. I just think that is important, because at the moment it sounds as if perhaps that's where we're going, and that we're going to come back and say, no, we don't like this. So, whilst I welcome the questions that we're asking in the recommendation, it is, we are reserving our right, we are reserving our judgment on this. I think that is kind of the wording I'd look for, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if you can help us sort of convey something in that.
Do you want to let somebody else speak?
I'll finish, Mr. Chairman. I'll say thank you very much for listening.
No, that's fine. Graham, did you want to make a?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Just in relation to the amendment from Councillor Reid, at the moment, we don't have a proposal on the table in terms, this is a recommendation. And I just wanted clarity as to whether Councillor Reid, in making that amendment to the recommendations, if you're proposing the recommendations as on page 61, as amended, so that is a proposition for the committee to consider. So I just wanted clarity on that point.
It's not on the table.
Excuse me a moment.
Oh, he's had a second, has he?
Yeah,
I apologise.
Hold on, Phil.
Had a second.
Can we have a little bit of order, please?
Sorry,
Robert, were you going to
Well, I was
answer
just
the
going
question?
to answer the question and clarity.
Yes, Arish.
Microphone.
Mr. Chairman, if you go on page 42, the very first line says South Kesteven District Council wishes to place on record its formal holding objections and such time as the above issues have been addressed. So isn't that very similar to what actually Councillor Reid has just proposed for the robust investigation?
Emma, do you want to come in?
The recommendation as made by officers is essentially saying to the applicant, we don't have sufficient robust information and detail in the environmental report to be able to say that we are content at this stage with how you are proposing to collate evidence. It's not actually about the final outcome, whether we supported the scheme or not. What I understand Councillor Reid's amendment was to add some lines to say that we remain concerned, irrespective of whether they resolve the technical studies, we still remain concerned about the overall proposals in relation to impact on the environment, loss of agricultural land and one of the other things.
Harmful,
Community.
harmful to our environment and our community.
Correct. So that's an additional, your technical studies don't quite cut the mustard. And we still are exceedingly concerned with the proposal as a whole. That's as I understand it.
That is inclusive in proposal. After adding the line.
Yeah, Irish, can you put your microphone on, please? And can everybody stop talking over each other, please, and just do it one at a time?
I apologize, Mr. Chairman.
Carry on.
So taking Councillor Reid's proposal, addition of the line, and then it includes furthermore the paragraph 7.2 to 7.8 as part of the recommendations within it.
Councillor Reid, you was going to clarify.
Well, with respect, I was going to clarify what the monitoring officer had asked of me. I'm a little bit concerned about the page because I'm working from page 39 of the report, which is the recommendation. Okay.
Sorry, Councillor Reid, I think the recommendation is referred to at the beginning of the report, but there's a detailed recommendation set out on page 61 of the pack, which sets out a lot more detail in relation to the response that the council is seeking to make.
Well, to reply to that then, Mr. Chairman, I don't mind whether it's at 39 or at 60, whatever it is. The recommendation was made on the premise of what we've heard, what's been debated, and what our people have had to speak on. And the word robust has come up on several occasions, whereby which it's finely balanced. I still come back to the recommendation and stand by that it's on the detriment of agricultural outputs, harm to our environment and community, because I really feel that those issues are within this consultation. After all, we're not approving the planning commission. It's not even our premise to do so. We are trying to demonstrate the local needs on balance with renewable energies in our way forward and what we've been asked to do. Thank you.
Graham, do you want to comment again, please?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So paragraph 7.1 on page 61 is the same paragraph that's referred to at the beginning of the report. So the amendment will still stand. What I'm just seeking to clarify for the benefit of the committee is that in proposing that amended recommendation, is Councillor Reid also proposing the recommendations on page 61? Because if that's the case, that needs seconding, and then we've got a motion that's being debated.
Thanks, Graham. Councillor Mills, please.
This might be helpful, but just to change those words slightly, we could amend robustly challenging the information provided with this pre-application on grounds of potential detriment in terms of our agricultural output, harms to our environment and community, and therefore require the further information as detailed below. It is paramount, something like that.
It's the same essence. I'm quite happy with that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If Sarah's happy to continue to second it.
Could you write that down, Penny, please?
Yes, I'll rewrite it.
Do you want to, I'll go to Phil, then to Richard.
I'm happy to listen to what Vice Chairman says, but in reply to Councillor Reid's amendment, it is, as Councillor Harris says, it's actually covered well. I looked at it and thought, can you go a little bit further the other way, if you can say? But paragraph 7.7, it says, as such, and this is of the recommendation. This is our recommendation. South Kesteven District Council wishes to place on record its former holding objection until such time as the above issues have been addressed. Now, the above issues are peer review of the agricultural land and soils, the peer review of the landscape and visual chapter, and the overall Mallard Farm Appendix A. It is all there. And I just think, I think it would be a pity to break the consensus that I think we've seen this afternoon of a sensible debate. So I would vote against that amendment. Thank you.
Councillor Cleaver, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Could I suggest a simple alternative, which is that in paragraph 7.2 on the penultimate line, the word also is replaced by the words this council. Sorry, comma, and this council.
Well, I think what we'll do is we'll deal with the First Amendment first, and then otherwise, because if people making so many different suggestions now, like I say, we're going to lose track of what we're doing. Councillor Judy Stevens. Oh, or was it Sarah? Sorry.
Yeah, I think what obviously Councillor Reid and Councillor Mills has fine-tuned, it summarises very eloquently what is said in the document, which is good. So I think, you have an introduction, you've got the report, and then I think it makes it's very clear and defined. Those are the issues we agree with. I think we, as a group, we agree with that. So I'll certainly stick by my second.
I think also, I'll just make a comment myself here. There's obviously a marked difference between what's happening at Fockingham and what's happening at Essendine, Gretford and what have you. And there's obviously a very good reason for that. Like I say, apparently the application's been sort of well accepted locally, whereas this one's obviously just caused hostility, mainly due to its size and its local impact on local amenity and what have you. Councillor Judy Stevens, please.
I do actually support the amendment because I don't think it flies in the face of any consensus that we've had this afternoon. I think to kind of sort of polarize the debate and to say that some of us are sitting here sweltering in the middle of climate change, saying that we're not in favour of solar energy would be ridiculous, quite honestly. Of course we are. But what the problem we've got here is that we've got it's a huge swathe of land which calls into consideration other elements as well, some of which are just as important to our way of life as solar energy is. So I certainly don't think that it really does fly in the face of any consensus. Maybe people would like to think it does and we're divided, but I don't think we are. I think we're all in support of it. I think the issues here are particularly because of the magnitude of it, and that we clearly this afternoon have identified some issues which we haven't got answers for, and we would like to see those going forward. So we're not making any final decision on this. As we know, we are just looking, and I would say I would support the amendment, and I'd like to go to the vote if possible. Thank you.
Councillor Harris, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm a bit confused at the moment. So the proposal that's been put by Councillor Reid and Councillor Mills is just paragraph 7.1 has been altered, and that as a standalone. It doesn't include further on paragraph 7.2, 3, 4 up to 8 within it. Or do we have the alternative recommendations as recommended by the officers on chapter 7, which includes 7.1 to 7.8 as proposed? If that is the case, then I will propose that particular, that we accept the recommendations of the officer.
I'm not sure what you're, a little bit, yeah, Emma, please.
By the speak now. By the power of magic Teams message, I am in communication with the monitoring officer at the back. I think that was the point that Graham was trying to establish, and I believe that Councillor Reid nodded, but perhaps ought to confirm verbally for the record, that the suggested amendment was to paragraph 7.1, but the rest of the text in the recommendation would still stand. Is that correct? And perhaps you could just confirm.
I will confirm, yes.
And then just for clarity, I assume Councillor Trotter, you were seconding that. Correct. Thank you.
Can you also confirm that you're quite happy to change the wording of it to Councillor Mills?
I didn't want to complicate the issue, but I conceded to that, so perhaps she needs to say yes.
Could you, just for the benefit of everybody, Penny, can you just repeat what the amendment is?
Can we read out exactly what paragraph 7.1 will say in full if the amendment were to be passed, just to be absolutely clear? Thank you.
So I would have thought we can keep the original words in 7.1 and then add a little, it's just a little bit of padding, isn't it? It's a little bit of a summary to say SKDC is robustly challenging the information provided with this pre-application on the grounds of potential detriment to our agricultural output, harms to our environment and communities. Therefore, it's of paramount importance. Therefore, of paramount importance is the requested further information identified below. So it just summarizes, really. And I think, you know, the rest of it is fine. It's all identified in those consultants' reports. And, you know, this is a land use issue. We've got renewable energy policies, but we have to be looking site specifically, in my mind. As people have alluded to, there might be other sites that are perfectly acceptable and other sites that aren't. So that is why we need all this information giving to us, so that that weights and balances of the benefits and the harms can be properly weighed up. Is that right?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Can I just clarify, do we have a seconder? Councillor Trotter, thank you. I think, unless I get, yeah, I'm getting thumbs up at the back, so we're all good on the monitoring side. Thank you.
Harris, did you want to comment?
No, Mr. Chair, let the question be put.
Do we need it reading out again, or hold on, Councillor Stokes, please.
Yes, I'm listening with great interest, and I consider this as a completely irrelevant thing. You know, it's all there in the recommendations that we've already got, particularly at 7.5, Appendix C, which I mentioned earlier. And I certainly won't support this. The quicker we can get these done, the better, although I shan't be alive in 2050.
Well, we're going to have to come to some sort of consensus to get this through. So,
Well, you
yeah.
need to go to the vote, Mr.
Yeah.
Chairman, and it either
Okay.
stands or falls.
okay. Do we want it repeating again then? Yes? Yeah. So the amendment to the recommendation is.
So this is, so this is a new paragraph 7.2, and then the paragraphs below are renumbered. Is that correct?
No, it's an
No?
amendment to 7.1, just an addition to the end of 7.1.
So just for clarity, paragraph 7.1 would read, I need to put my glasses on, that the committee endorsed the following draft response to Mallard Pass Solar Farm Limited and delegate authority to the Assistant Director of Planning in consultation with the portfolio holder to issue the final response. SKDC is robustly challenging the information provided with this pre-application on the grounds of potential detriment to our agriculture output, harms to our environment and communities. Therefore, of paramount importance is the requested further information identified below, paras 7.2 through to 7.8, which stand as drafted in the papers. Thank you.
So we've heard the amendment to the recommendation. We'll go to the vote. All those in favour? All those against? Abstentions? So that is
That's carried,
Carried.
Chairman.
Yep.
7 for, 2 against and 1 abstention.
right. So that's carried. Thank you very much, everybody.
Chairman,
Mr. Chairman, could you
point of
record
order.
my
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
my vote against? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, you now need to go to the substantive. That was an amendment.
Graham, please.
Okay, Chairman, for the purpose of me seeking clarity as to how the recommendations were being proposed is that there wasn't anything on the table to amend. So councillor Reid had proposed an amended version of the recommendation as the motion for debate. So that had been seconded. That was the motion up for debate. So there's no substantive motion because that motion is the motion that was proposed for debate.
Mr. Chairman, it's not the way I understand.
I think what Graham's saying is nobody proposed or seconded the recommendation in the first place. So that was the substantive motion for a
I
start.
would have supported the substantive if
Yeah.
there'd been one.
Moving back to the agenda. Don't think there's any other business? No? And what's the time? The time is 16:50.